It was one of the strangest battles of the Second World War, a clash that defied every convention of war, where sworn enemies stood shoulder to shoulder against a common foe. In the final, chaotic days of Nazi Germany, as the Reich crumbled and surrender loomed, a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps became the stage for a story so improbable it sounds like fiction. Inside Castle Itter were some of Europe's most prominent prisoners, French politicians, generals, and even former prime ministers held hostage by the SS as bargaining chips for a dying regime. But as the end approached, these captives would witness a bizarre alliance: weary American soldiers, desperate Wehrmacht troops who had turned against Hitler, and even Austrian resistance fighters, all banding together to hold off an SS counterattack. Tanks rumbled into narrow alpine passes, gunfire echoed off stone walls, and the battle for a single castle turned into a symbol of war's absurdity and humanity's resilience. This documentary will take you through the strange journey of Castle Itter, from its role as a prison, to the desperation of its captives, to the day enemies became allies and fought side by side. You'll meet the French VIPs whose lives hung in the balance, the American tank crew that raced against time, and the German commander who chose defiance of the SS over blind obedience. It is a story of courage, irony, and survival that remains one of the most remarkable episodes in the entire war. So settle in as we unfold the entire history of the Battle of Castle Itter, chapter by chapter, in vivid detail. And before we begin, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is there right now. We always love to see how this history connects people across the world. Nestled high in the Austrian Tyrol, Castle Itter was a medieval stronghold long before it became a backdrop for one of the strangest battles of the Second World War. Built in the 13th century, it was designed not only as a fortress, but as a symbol of feudal authority that dominated the rugged alpine valleys below. Its stone walls, thick and formidable, seemed timeless, guarding a landscape of winding passes, snow-capped peaks, and narrow river gorges. For centuries, lords and noble families had controlled the site, using it as both residence and defensive bastion. In the 19th century, when empires reshaped Europe's boundaries, the castle was modernized, fitted with more livable quarters, and transformed into something between a manor and a fortress. By the dawn of the 20th century, it had fallen into private hands, leased at times to wealthy individuals seeking the romance of an alpine retreat. Its medieval towers, perched like watchful eyes above the village of Itter, became part of the postcard scenery of Tyrol. Yet beneath its romantic facade, the castle's strategic value had never vanished. Its commanding view of the valleys made it a natural place for control and surveillance. Its isolation, difficult to reach, and surrounded by forests, gave it an air of secrecy. These qualities, once prized by nobles and landowners, would later appeal to men with far darker ambitions. In the shifting landscape of the late 1930s, Castle Itter stood as an unassuming relic, waiting to be pulled into the currents of World War. The Anschluss of Austria in 1938 marked a turning point in the castle's fate. When Nazi Germany absorbed Austria, its architecture, estates, and resources were quickly catalogued by party officials and SS officers seeking properties of use to the Reich. Castle Itter, with its remoteness and strong stone fortifications, caught their attention almost immediately. The Gestapo and SS had long sought secluded sites to hold important figures away from prying eyes and Allied intelligence. In 1940, after pressure from Nazi authorities, the castle was seized from its owner, a wealthy Austrian businessman who had leased parts of it to international figures. The SS quickly took control, placing the site under the administrative umbrella of Dachau concentration camp. They realized that the medieval fortress, while romantic in appearance, could serve a grim new purpose. Its thick walls made escape nearly impossible. Its isolation meant that locals could be easily intimidated into silence. And its alpine location placed it squarely within the collapsing defensive shell that the Nazis still believed they could hold. Thus, a castle that once echoed with medieval songs and noble banquets became entwined with the machinery of dictatorship. What had been a place of prestige was now transformed into a fortress of fear. By 1943, Castle Itter had fully entered the Nazi prison system. Unlike Dachau or Buchenwald, it was not built to house thousands, nor was it designed as an extermination site. Instead, it was designated as a special prison, a location to confine high-value captives whose fates were too politically sensitive to be left to the chaos of larger camps. French politicians, generals, and cultural figures were quietly transferred there, guarded not by ordinary police, but by the SS. The choice was deliberate. Prisoners here were to be isolated, cut off from networks of resistance, and kept under direct control for possible use as bargaining chips. The SS understood that in a collapsing Europe, prominent hostages could be bartered, executed, or paraded as propaganda trophies. Castle Itter became part of this cynical calculation. The prisoners brought into its walls were not nameless, faceless individuals, but men who had shaped nations, commanded armies, and influenced culture. For them, the medieval stone halls were not a romantic retreat, but a gilded cage. The irony of noble architecture, masking a place of despair, was not lost on the locals, who whispered of the fortress with unease. From its towers the castle seemed almost to brood, aware of the sinister role it had been forced to play. The castle's architecture lent itself perfectly to this new role. Its high curtain walls created natural barriers against intrusion or escape. Watchtowers provided 360-degree vantage points over the surrounding countryside, ensuring guards could spot anyone approaching from miles away. The inner courtyards, once designed for gatherings and celebrations, were now places of roll calls, intimidation, and control. Barracks were carved into its chambers, with cells prepared to house small numbers of captives in tightly monitored conditions. The SS reinforced entrances with steel doors and barbed wire, leaving no doubt about its new purpose. The fortress atmosphere instilled dread, even without the scale of Auschwitz or Dachau. For the French VIPs brought here, the grandeur of the architecture became an eerie reminder of their captivity, magnificent stone walls that testified not to freedom but to imprisonment. Locals who lived in nearby villages soon began avoiding the area, speaking in hushed tones about the castle's new tenants. Though it lacked the infamous reputation of larger camps, word spread that something unusual, even sinister, was happening in this quiet corner of Tyrol. Castle Itter was no longer a relic of the past. It had become a living part of the Nazi system of oppression. The symbolic importance of Castle Itter went far beyond its practical use. To the SS, it was a showcase of their reach. Even medieval bastions in remote Austria could be bent to the service of the Reich. To the Allies, once news trickled out, it became a disturbing reminder of how the Nazis valued their hostages. The French prisoners held there included former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, generals like Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, and figures of intellectual and cultural prominence. Their captivity symbolized the humiliation of a once proud nation, now under German occupation. Every stone of the castle seemed to echo with that symbolism. A fortress that had once represented European nobility now reflected Europe's subjugation under tyranny. Yet there was also irony by concentrating so many influential men in one place. The SS unwittingly created a microcosm of resistance waiting to awaken. The walls that were meant to contain also gave shape to a stage on which one of the war's strangest dramas would later unfold. In this way, Castle Itter was not just a prison, it was a symbol of the contradictions of a collapsing Reich. The Tyrol region itself added layers of complexity to the story. This alpine land, dotted with villages and farms, had been annexed to the Reich along with Austria in 1938. Many locals were ambivalent. Some had embraced Nazism, while others longed for a quieter, more traditional existence. The presence of Castle Itter as an SS stronghold created a climate of fear. Villagers avoided talking about the prisoners, though they occasionally glimpsed SS convoys bringing supplies up the narrow mountain roads. The fortress loomed above them as a reminder of both German power and Austrian complicity. It also symbolized the intrusion of global war into even the most remote valleys. What had once been a serene alpine landmark was now entangled in the destinies of nations. For those who dared whisper about it, Castle Itter became shorthand for secrets, danger, and the shadow of Nazi cruelty. The mountain air may have been crisp and clear, but the atmosphere around the castle was heavy with suspicion. Every stone in its walls seemed to carry the weight of history and the menace of the present. The transformation of Castle Itter was also part of a broader Nazi pattern. Across occupied Europe, castles, monasteries, and estates were seized and repurposed. Some became command centers. Others turned into prisons or barracks. The Nazis understood the psychological power of such architecture, how symbols of old order could be co-opted into the new Reich. In Castle Itter's case, the isolation was as valuable as the walls. Secluded in the mountains, surrounded by forest and steep passes, it was both inaccessible and intimidating. This made it ideal not just for imprisoning high-value captives, but for projecting a subtle message: nowhere was safe from the SS. The fortress became a prison, not through accident but through design. Every choice, from the allocation of guards to the reinforcement of gates, reflected deliberate strategy. For the Nazis, Castle Itter was a tool. For the prisoners trapped within, it was a labyrinth of despair. For the villagers who lived under its shadow, it was a chilling presence they could not ignore. By 1944, Castle Itter had become a small but significant node in the sprawling map of Nazi terror. Its stone walls held only a handful of captives, but those captives represented entire nations. The French political elite within its confines carried the weight of their country's defeat and the hope of its eventual liberation. The SS officers in charge saw them as pawns to be used in the Reich's final games. Yet beneath the surface, the castle was a powder keg, ready to ignite under the right circumstances. Its symbolic value, its remote location, and its bizarre mix of captors and captives all set the stage for the extraordinary events that would follow. What began as a medieval fortress, reshaped into a Nazi prison, would soon become the site of one of the most improbable alliances of the war. German soldiers, American troops, and French dignitaries would fight side by side within its walls. Castle Itter, which had stood for centuries as a witness to Europe's changing tides, was about to write the strangest chapter of its long history, and it all began with its transformation into a fortress of fear in the heart of the Alps. By the spring of 1945, the German Reich stood on the edge of total collapse, its once fearsome armies shattered on every front. In the west, American, British, and French forces surged across the Rhine, pouring into the industrial heartland of Germany. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut pressed relentlessly, rolling through Poland, Hungary, and into the outskirts of Berlin itself. Entire cities lay in ruins, reduced to rubble from endless bombing campaigns and brutal street fighting. Food shortages and fuel scarcity crippled the German war machine, leaving tanks abandoned on roadsides and soldiers fighting with dwindling supplies. Civilians, once caught up in the feverish promises of the Reich, now lived in terror of advancing armies, air raids, and the vengeful reckoning that seemed inevitable. Hitler's promises of secret weapons and miraculous victories rang hollow as desperation replaced fanaticism in the ranks of the Wehrmacht. Yet, even as the Allies closed in, Nazi propaganda insisted that ultimate victory was possible if only the people remained steadfast. In this atmosphere of contradiction, the German population was trapped between fear, denial, and resignation. Castle Itter, isolated in the Tyrolean mountains, became a microcosm of this turmoil. Its walls contained not only prisoners, but also the anxieties of a collapsing Reich. The chain of command within Germany had begun to disintegrate in frightening ways. Orders from Berlin were delayed, contradictory, or outright impossible to carry out as communication lines failed and divisions were encircled. Hitler demanded that no ground be given up, issuing edicts that armies stand fast even when surrounded and without hope. His generals, once confident professionals, now found themselves unable to reconcile his fantasies with the brutal realities on the battlefield. Many commanders acted independently, withdrawing to save their men, while others obeyed blindly, dooming entire divisions to annihilation. In Austria, this chaos was particularly pronounced. The Tyrol, considered a fallback area by some Nazi leaders, was flooded with retreating units, SS detachments, and desperate civilians. Roads clogged with carts, trucks, and military convoys as order gave way to confusion. Desertions grew more common, with soldiers discarding uniforms and trying to disappear among fleeing civilians. Meanwhile, rogue SS groups roamed, determined to punish defeatism wherever they found it. In this breakdown of discipline, places like Castle Itter became dangerously unpredictable, their fate tied to the whims of whichever force stumbled upon them. Allied forces, by this stage, were advancing with overwhelming momentum. The Americans, having crossed the Rhine at Remagen and forced Germany's western defences to crumble, pressed southward into Bavaria and Austria. British units secured northern Germany, cutting off escape routes to Denmark and the Baltic. The Soviets, advancing from the east, had already encircled Berlin, reducing the capital of the Reich to a fortress under constant bombardment. In Austria, General Jacob Devers's 6th Army Group and General George Patton's 3rd Army spearheaded the thrusts into Tyrol, aiming to block German retreats into the Alpine National Redoubt. This so-called last stand fortress, long rumoured and exaggerated, was little more than Nazi propaganda, but it still shaped Allied operational goals. The mountains and valleys of Austria, dotted with castles and villages, became the final stage where remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS, and fleeing officials hoped to make their stand. For the Allies, advancing here meant overcoming not only terrain, but also sporadic, desperate resistance from units unwilling to surrender. Each village, tunnel, and mountain pass held the potential for sudden firefights. Into this chaotic landscape fell the strange fate of Castle Itter. Inside Germany, the Nazi leadership fractured under the pressure of defeat. Hitler, increasingly delusional, withdrew into his bunker in Berlin, issuing frantic commands and refusing to acknowledge reality. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, secretly attempted to negotiate with the Allies while still demanding loyalty from his forces. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's heir apparent, sought to preserve his own power, even as the Luftwaffe lay in ruins. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, argued futilely for realistic measures to preserve infrastructure, while Hitler demanded a scorched earth policy that would leave nothing for the invaders. This internal struggle among Nazi leaders filtered down to the field, where officers and soldiers no longer knew whose orders to obey. Some units fought with fanatical desperation, fearing execution if they retreated. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, weary of a war clearly lost. Civilians caught in the crossfire found themselves at the mercy of both retreating Nazis and advancing armies. The entire Reich seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse and chaos, like a decaying edifice crumbling under its own contradictions. Within this larger collapse, the isolated drama at Castle Itter was taking shape. Austria, though geographically peripheral to Berlin, became a critical zone in these final days. The Tyrolean Alps, with their valleys and mountain fortresses, were whispered about in Nazi circles as part of the Alpenfestung, or Alpine Redoubt. This mythical stronghold, where Nazi leaders would supposedly retreat and wage guerrilla war, was more fantasy than reality. Nevertheless, the idea influenced both German and Allied decisions in early 1945. The Allies pressed rapidly into Austria to prevent such a bastion from forming, while German leaders moved men and resources into the region in desperate hope of prolonging resistance. In Tyrol, this meant an influx of SS units, Wehrmacht detachments, and retreating convoys. Villages became staging grounds, while castles and mountain strongholds were pressed into service. The landscape, once serene, now bristled with military activity and suspicion. Civilians, already exhausted by years of war, saw their valleys transformed into battlegrounds. It was within this tense, overburdened environment that Castle Itter became a focal point. For the French prisoners confined within Castle Itter, the crumbling Reich outside meant both hope and terror. Hope, because the sound of distant artillery and the reports of Allied advances hinted that liberation was near. Terror, because no one knew how the SS guards would react as defeat loomed. Would they execute their hostages to prevent their rescue, or would they abandon them in the chaos? Rumors filtered in through sympathetic villagers or overheard guard conversations, but clarity was rare. The prisoners lived in constant suspense, each day wondering whether the end of the war would bring survival or execution. The symbolism of their captivity weighed heavily on them. These were men who had once shaped France's destiny, political leaders, generals, cultural figures, now reduced to bargaining chips in the Nazis' collapsing hand. Their fate depended on the chaos of war's final days and the choices of desperate men. Each passing hour brought both danger and possibility. Castle Itter, perched in its mountain isolation, seemed to embody the precariousness of their situation. As April turned into May, the inevitability of German defeat was undeniable. American troops poured deeper into Bavaria and Austria, while Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. Hitler's suicide on April 30th shattered what little cohesion remained among Nazi loyalists. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, his successor, sought to negotiate partial surrenders to the Western Allies, while continuing resistance against the Soviets. This contradictory strategy only deepened the confusion on the ground. Some units surrendered en masse to Americans, hoping to avoid capture by the Red Army. Others continued to fight pointless skirmishes, driven by propaganda or sheer fear. In Tyrol, these contradictions reached their climax, with SS fanatics still patrolling even as entire Wehrmacht groups laid down arms. The Third Reich had become a fragmented corpse, twitching with violent spasms as it finally died. Amid this collapse, the story of Castle Itter was about to intersect with the chaos of history in a way no one could have predicted. The collapse of Nazi chains of command created an atmosphere of lawlessness where survival instincts overrode discipline and ideology. German officers, who had once barked orders now fled in civilian clothes, abandoning their men. SS detachments, stripped of centralized orders, carried out atrocities or retreated into the mountains to wage guerrilla war. Civilians scrambled to protect their families, hiding in cellars or fleeing through alpine passes. The old world of Nazi authority had dissolved, but what replaced it was confusion, violence, and desperation. Castle Itter, isolated yet strategically positioned, stood at the crossroads of this collapse. Within its walls, French hostages waited anxiously, while their guards weighed conflicting impulses of duty, fear, and self-preservation. Outside its gates, Allied forces and German defectors were converging, drawn by fate into a confrontation unlike any other in the war. In the final days of the Reich, this medieval fortress would become the stage for one of history's most extraordinary battles. The end of the Nazi Empire was not orderly, but chaotic, and in that chaos, Castle Itter's strange destiny was sealed. Castle Itter did not house nameless victims or anonymous captives, but some of the most prominent figures in modern French history. Among its walls were former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, both men who had steered France through the stormy waters of the 1930s and the fall of 1940. Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, architects of French military strategy during the opening phases of the war, found themselves stripped of command and confined. Alongside them was François de la Roque, a conservative political leader, and Michel Clemenceau, son of Georges Clemenceau, the famed tiger of World War I. Jean Borotra, the world-renowned tennis champion, added a bizarre touch of cultural celebrity to the prisoner roster. These men, once accustomed to political power, military command, or cultural fame, were now reduced to bargaining chips in the collapsing Reich. The Nazis kept them here, not out of cruelty alone, but because their names carried weight on the international stage. Should the war turn in unexpected directions, they might be used as hostages in negotiations or propaganda tools to showcase Nazi control. Their imprisonment was thus both personal and symbolic, a microcosm of occupied France's humiliation. Every arrival of a new figure deepened the castle's bizarre status as a prison for the elite. By the spring of 1945, Castle Itter had become less a medieval fortress and more a surreal gathering of France's fallen leaders. Life inside the castle for these VIP prisoners was a mixture of privilege and suffering, unlike the brutalized masses in larger concentration camps. They were not subjected to back-breaking forced labor or starvation rations, though food was increasingly scarce as Germany's supply system collapsed. Their quarters, while Spartan, were cleaner than the wooden barracks of Dachau, with stone rooms providing some shelter against the alpine chill. Yet comfort could not disguise captivity, nor alleviate the gnawing uncertainty of their fates. Every meal was a reminder of dependence, every guard's glance a reminder of vulnerability. The castle's small courtyards gave little space for exercise, and prisoners often walked in circles like caged animals. Conversations revolved around politics, old rivalries, and anxious speculation about the future of Europe. Some prisoners argued bitterly about the failures of 1940, while others tried to maintain civility in the face of despair. The boredom of confinement was pierced by moments of fear when rumors of executions or transfers surfaced. Guards often kept them in deliberate suspense, alternating between indifference and menace. The prisoners clung to dignity by discussing books, recalling past glories, or rehearsing the arguments they might one day make before history. Each day was a balancing act between intellectual pride and the crushing reality of imprisonment. The relationships among the prisoners were as complex as their political histories. Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, once bitter rivals in the chambers of the French government, found themselves forced into reluctant companionship. Generals Weygand and Gamelin, who had each commanded French forces during the disastrous campaigns of 1940, carried the heavy burden of defeat on their shoulders. Accusations sometimes simmered in their conversations, with blame cast for strategies that had left France prostrate before Germany. François de la Roque, who had led a right-wing political movement in the 1930s, stood ideologically apart from the Republicans among them. Michel Clemenceau, bearing the famous name of his father, embodied the ghost of a more glorious French past, which made the humiliation of the present sting even sharper. Jean Birotra, a sportsman rather than a statesman, often served as a bridge between these men, his humor and athletic vigor easing tensions. Yet these differences also reflected the fractured nature of French politics itself, a fragmentation that the Nazis had exploited during occupation. Within the stone walls of Castle Itter, old disputes lingered like smoke, impossible to dispel entirely. Still, survival forced cooperation, as even the proudest men recognized they shared a common fate. The irony of France's divided leaders imprisoned together was not lost on anyone. History seemed to have conspired to place them here, to reflect the tragedy of a nation undone. Their captors treated them with a mix of harsh discipline and calculated restraint. SS guards knew they held valuable prisoners and thus avoided outright brutality, but intimidation was a constant. Roll calls, inspections, and sudden searches reminded the French dignitaries that their lives were balanced on the whims of the Reich. Guards sometimes threatened them with execution should the Allies draw too near, a psychological weapon that left the men in constant dread. Food, already scarce across Austria, became increasingly meager, leaving even privileged captives thin and malnourished. Medicines were almost impossible to obtain, and older prisoners suffered greatly from untreated ailments. Yet the SS occasionally provided newspapers or allowed controlled conversations, partly to monitor morale and partly to maintain appearances. These small allowances did little to mask the reality of captivity. The prisoners lived in a constant state of heightened awareness, uncertain whether each day would bring liberation or death. Their guards, themselves demoralized by the collapsing Reich, vacillated between obedience and apathy. For the French elite, survival became an exercise in patience, endurance, and the careful management of fragile hopes. As the war's end drew closer, the atmosphere inside the castle grew increasingly tense. The sound of artillery echoed faintly through the Tyrolean valleys. Carried by the alpine winds, prisoners strained to interpret each distant boom as a sign of Allied approach. Rumors swirled of American forces moving into Bavaria, of Soviet troops closing in on Vienna, and of German units deserting en masse. Yet uncertainty gnawed at them. Would they be freed before the SS decided to silence them permanently? Some prisoners tried to maintain optimism, imagining the triumphant return to France after liberation. Others retreated inward, fearing the possibility of last-minute executions. The guards themselves grew restless, muttering about orders from Berlin and the collapse of command. Each passing day seemed to tighten the noose of fate around Castle Itter. The tension was so thick that even the mundane, like the serving of soup or the unlocking of doors, became moments charged with dread. It was a waiting game played in the shadow of history, and no one knew how much longer it would last. Despite captivity, the prisoners clung to routines as a way to resist despair. Mornings often began with short walks in the courtyard, followed by heated discussions of politics and war. Jane Borotra, ever the athlete, attempted to maintain exercise by pacing, stretching, and even improvising sports with scraps of material. Others kept their minds sharp by debating philosophy, law, and military history, as though the castle were a strange university without freedom. Daladier and Reynaud sparred verbally, replaying arguments from their days in government while Weygand and Gamelin dissected campaigns long lost. In the evenings, when the castle grew quiet, some prisoners whispered prayers, others hummed songs, and a few recorded secret notes in diaries smuggled onto scraps of paper. These rituals, small as they were, offered dignity in the face of powerlessness. They also built fragile solidarity, reminding the captives they were still men of intellect and will, not mere prisoners. The castle's stone walls could contain their bodies, but not fully extinguish their spirits. Yet beneath the surface of routine lurked the fear of sudden violence. The SS, unpredictable and desperate, could change the course of their lives in a single order. Thus, every routine carried an undertone of defiance and fragility. Contact with the outside world was rare, but occasional glimpses deepened both hope and anxiety. Sympathetic Austrian villagers, risking punishment, sometimes passed scraps of food, or whispered news to prisoners through intermediaries. From guards, too, bits of information filtered in, mentions of Hitler's bunker, of bombings in Munich, of Allied breakthroughs. The prisoners clung to these fragments, weaving them into narratives of hope or despair. A rumor of American tanks in Bavaria might lift spirits for days, only to be dashed by silence. Prisoners also feared that such rumors might provoke guards into preemptive violence. Every whisper carried double meaning: liberation or execution, salvation or doom. The castle's isolation heightened the suspense, as though time itself slowed in its shadowed corridors. Conversations often circled endlessly around the same question: what would happen to them when the Reich finally fell? No one could answer with certainty, and the lack of clarity gnawed at them more than physical deprivation. Each rumor became both a torchlight and a dagger, illuminating possibilities but cutting into their nerves. In this way, uncertainty was itself a weapon, wielded by circumstance and fear alike. By May of 1945, the prisoners of Castle Itter were living on the knife's edge of fate. Liberation seemed tantalizingly close, yet the risk of annihilation hovered just as near. The collapse of Nazi authority, rather than bringing relief, made their situation more dangerous than ever. They had become pawns in a war, entering its final chaotic spasms. Within the castle walls, French political titans and cultural icons shared the same fragile existence as any captive, stripped of rank and waiting for destiny. Outside the gates, the Reich crumbled, its armies surrendering by the tens of thousands, yet its SS fanatics clung to the creed of death before defeat. The contrast between grandeur of names and fragility of circumstances was stark. Here were the men who had shaped France's fate, reduced to shadows pacing courtyards under German guard. Yet their captivity also symbolized resilience. Despite humiliation, they endured. The medieval stones of Castle Itter absorbed their anxieties, their whispered debates, their fragile hopes. Unknown to them, events beyond the castle's walls were converging toward a climax. The strangest battle of the war was about to erupt, and they would be at its very heart. The men who oversaw Castle Itter belonged to the SS, the most feared arm of Hitler's machinery of terror. They were not frontline soldiers fighting desperate battles on the Eastern Front, but wardens of a prison designed for symbolic captives. Their power came not from numbers but from the uniform they wore, the black insignia that carried with it the authority of the Reich. Prisoners understood that the SS were bound less by military discipline than by ideology, indoctrinated to serve without compassion. Even in the castle's isolated halls, their presence radiated menace, a reminder that life and death were decided at a guard's whim. The prisoners often felt watched, even in moments of solitude, as if the eyes of the SS penetrated the stone walls. Rumors circulated of executions in other camps, of hostages shot when defeat loomed, and those whispers hung over Castle Itter like a storm cloud. The SS guards fed this atmosphere of dread deliberately, hinting at reprisals if the Allies drew too close. Their authority was fragile in the spring of 1945, yet they wielded it with theatrical cruelty. Each order barked in the courtyard echoed with the weight of an empire collapsing, yet still dangerous. For the prisoners, every glance from a guard could carry the threat of sudden violence. In this way, fear became as constant a presence as the cold stone itself. The command structure at Castle Itter reflected the corruption and fanaticism of the SS. Unlike regular army officers, the SS men here were drawn from a system that prized loyalty to Hitler above all else. Their allegiance was not to strategy or common sense, but to the ideology of racial supremacy and the cult of obedience. Many of them had been trained in Dachau, where cruelty was normalized and compassion beaten out of recruits. They carried into Castle Itter the mindset that prisoners were less than human, no matter their former stature. Some guards enforced rules with rigid discipline, taking satisfaction in instilling terror through silence and stares. Others indulged in petty acts of humiliation, knowing their captives were powerless to resist. The prisoners quickly learned that there was no predicting which form of cruelty the day might bring. What remained consistent was the imbalance of power. SS men could punish at will, with no oversight beyond their own conscience. The collapse of German authority in 1945 only amplified this arbitrariness, as orders from above became contradictory and sporadic. In such a vacuum, the SS men became both masters and prisoners of their own ideology. They ruled Castle Itter with a volatile mix of fanaticism, fear, and uncertainty. The daily life of prisoners was structured around SS control, with every moment monitored and restricted. Roll calls in the courtyard began the day. Prisoners lined in rows under the eyes of guards, with rifles slung casually, yet menacingly. Conversations had to be muted, for even whispered words could provoke suspicion. Movement between chambers was limited, each door locked and unlocked at the whim of the SS. Meals were distributed in silence, thin rations ladled out under the gaze of men who seemed to relish the dependence of their captives. When tensions flared among the French dignitaries, guards sometimes encouraged disputes, finding amusement in watching powerful men reduced to bickering. They delighted in the irony that prime ministers and generals now had to request permission to light a fire or fetch water. At night the sound of boots on stone echoed through the halls, a reminder that surveillance never ceased. Prisoners often lay awake, straining to hear whether guards were approaching their rooms. Even silence carried menace, for the SS cultivated an environment where fear of the unknown was as potent as physical blows. In this way, psychological control became as effective as chains. The prisoners lived in constant anticipation of an act of cruelty, never knowing when it might strike. Yet brutality was not always expressed through overt violence, but through the calculated suggestion of it. Guards hinted at executions should the Allies approach, making prisoners believe their liberation might also be their death. They boasted of atrocities in other camps, reminding captives that their privileged status would not shield them forever. Sometimes they exaggerated their own power, claiming orders from Berlin demanded hostages be eliminated at the first sign of Allied troops. For the French dignitaries, these threats were credible, because history had shown that the SS was willing to slaughter without hesitation. Each rumor became a blade, pressed invisibly against their throats. The uncertainty was tormenting. Would their guards abandon them, or would they kill them first? This uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest weapon, more paralyzing than starvation or beatings. Even the smallest encounters carried hidden menace, an SS man lingering at the doorway, a rifle casually adjusted, a whisper shared in German just out of earshot. Every gesture seemed to imply that the prisoners' lives balanced on the edge of annihilation. The effect was corrosive, eroding hope, and leaving even the strongest men wary and subdued. Fear, carefully cultivated, ensured obedience without the need for open violence. It was domination through atmosphere, a prison of the mind as much as of stone. The castle itself amplified the power of the SS. Its narrow passages, barred windows, and towering walls created a constant sense of confinement. Guards could appear suddenly at any corner, their boots striking the stone with authority. The prisoners felt trapped not only by walls, but by the geography of the mountains, the steep valleys below making escape unthinkable. The SS capitalized on this, reminding their captives that there was nowhere to run and no one to turn to. The isolation of the Tyrol meant that Allied armies, though advancing, seemed impossibly far away. Even if freedom lay just beyond the mountains, the prisoners knew they could never reach it without help. The physical structure of the fortress became an extension of SS control, its medieval design repurposed to intimidate. Guards knew the terrain better than the captives, further enforcing the imbalance of power. The castle, in Nazi hands, was not simply a building but a psychological weapon. It loomed over the prisoners, reminding them of their helplessness. In this environment, the SS ruled with both walls and words, combining stone and terror into a seamless system of oppression. By early 1945, the SS men themselves were increasingly affected by the collapse of the Reich. Some remained fanatical, clinging to Hitler's commands with desperate devotion, convinced that death in service to the Führer was preferable to surrender. Others grew visibly nervous, aware that defeat meant not only the loss of power, but possible trials for war crimes. This internal tension made them unpredictable, swinging between arrogance and paranoia. A guard might sneer with confidence in the morning and whisper about desertion at night. The prisoners, watching closely, could sense these cracks in authority, but dared not exploit them openly. Even as fear gripped the guards, they remained dangerous, more likely to lash out as control slipped from their grasp. The atmosphere of Castle Itter in those weeks was like a pressure chamber, the weight of impending collapse pressing on both sides of the bars. Guards took out their frustrations on their prisoners, projecting their own fear onto those they controlled. The result was an intensification of psychological cruelty, even as the end of the war approached. In this paradox, fear ruled everyone inside the fortress. The SS were masters, and yet captives of their own failing world. Among the prisoners, the awareness of SS brutality fostered both caution and resolve. They knew that defiance could mean instant execution, but submission offered no guarantee of survival. The French leaders adapted in different ways. Some attempted to appease guards with politeness, while others adopted stoic silence. Jean Barotra, with his athletic charm, occasionally lightened moods, but even he could not pierce the hardened armor of SS fanaticism. Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier debated strategies of endurance, knowing their fates depended on forces outside their control. The generals, accustomed to command, now struggled with the helplessness of subordination to petty tyrants. Every interaction with a guard was a negotiation, a subtle game of reading moods and anticipating threats. The prisoners learned to interpret gestures, tones, and silences, trying to predict whether danger was imminent. This hyper-awareness was exhausting, draining their strength as much as hunger or confinement. Yet it also sharpened their determination to survive, to hold on until liberation. The SS may have ruled the castle, but the captives clung to their humanity in defiance. It was a quiet resistance, but resistance nonetheless. The brutality of the collapsing Nazi machine echoed far beyond Castle Itter. but within its walls the dynamic was distilled to its purest form. A handful of SS men, empowered by a dying ideology, held the lives of France's former leaders in their hands. They ruled not with armies or tanks, but with the constant threat of violence, magnified by the castle's isolation. Fear was their weapon, unpredictability their strategy, and intimidation their daily routine. Yet as the war drew to its chaotic end, even their power began to fray. Whispers of desertion and defeat grew louder, undermining their aura of control. The prisoners sensed that change was coming, though whether it would bring execution or liberation remained uncertain. The atmosphere in the castle was one of unbearable suspense, a waiting game played under the shadow of collapsing tyranny. The SS remained dangerous, but they were no longer invincible. Their control was fragile, their fear barely concealed, and their cruelty sharpened by desperation. Castle Itter stood as a microcosm of the Reich itself, still brutal, still capable of murder, but crumbling from within. In that crumbling, the stage was set for the strangest alliance of the war. In the final days of the Reich, amidst chaos and collapse, a figure emerged whose choices would shape the fate of Castle Itter. Major Josef Gangl. A seasoned Wehrmacht officer, Gangl had fought loyally for Germany through the campaigns of the war, but by 1945 his faith in Hitler and the Nazi regime had withered. Like many professional soldiers, he had grown weary of the fanatical orders pouring out of Berlin, commands that demanded hopeless stands and punished common sense with death. His service had given him first-hand knowledge of the price paid by ordinary soldiers and civilians for the delusions of their leaders. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Austria, Gangl found himself stationed in Wehrmacht, a small town not far from Castle Itter. Here he encountered not only the crumbling Wehrmacht, but also the terror wrought by SS detachments determined to enforce Hitler's will to the bitter end. The Tyrolean valleys had become battlegrounds, not just between Allies and Germans, but between Germans themselves, between the fanatics and those who had finally chosen humanity. Gangl belonged to the latter group, unwilling to sacrifice civilians for a lost cause. His disillusionment was not sudden, but the culmination of months of seeing senseless bloodshed. In his eyes, continuing to fight for Hitler meant nothing but dishonor. In turning away from fanaticism, Gangl was stepping onto the path of treason in Nazi terms, but of courage in human terms. Wehrmacht was a town caught in the grip of fear, a microcosm of Austria in the spring of 1945. The Wehrmacht still held sway in some areas, but SS detachments roamed the streets, determined to root out desertion and punish any sign of disloyalty. Civilians lived in terror of reprisals, hiding in their homes as rumors of execution spread. The town's leaders, priests, and ordinary farmers understood that surrender might save lives, yet to speak of it aloud was to invite death at the hands of the SS. Gangl, stationed with what remained of his artillery battalion, saw first-hand the suffering of these civilians. Instead of withdrawing with the retreating Wehrmacht, he began to think of protecting the people he was meant to occupy. His men, weary and disheartened, shared his disillusionment, many no longer willing to die for Hitler's collapsing Reich. In whispered conversations, Gangl confided his thoughts to trusted soldiers, hinting that their duty was no longer to Berlin, but to humanity. To resist the SS openly was dangerous, for betrayal lurked in every corner. Yet the moral line had already been crossed in Gangl's mind. His true enemy was no longer the Allies, but the fanatics of his own nation. In this shift, a German officer's conscience awakened against tyranny, and in that awakening, history began to turn toward Castle Itter. The immediate catalyst for Gangl's decision came from the brutality of the SS in the Tyrol. As German defeat loomed, Himmler's loyalists carried out a reign of terror against civilians they accused of defeatism or collaboration. Farmers who hoarded food were shot, local leaders who suggested surrender were hanged, and entire families lived under the threat of reprisal. Gangl, once sworn to fight alongside these men, now found himself recoiling from their cruelty. He understood that the SS were prepared to burn villages and massacre innocents rather than yield. For the people of Wehrmacht, surrender to the Allies was the only hope, but they had no voice strong enough to act. Gangl decided he would be that voice, using his position to shield the townspeople from annihilation. His conscience, hardened by years of war, refused to stand idle while innocents were crushed in the final spasms of Nazi power. This was not only a military decision but a moral one, a rejection of the oath that bound him to Hitler. For a German officer to act against the SS was treason punishable by death. Yet Gangl recognized that loyalty to humanity was greater than loyalty to tyranny. In this clarity he chose the path of resistance, knowing full well the risks. Gangl's first steps were cautious, for survival depended on secrecy and trust. He sought out local Austrian resistance figures, men and women who had been quietly opposing Nazi rule from within the shadows. These networks were small, fragmented, and constantly hunted by the Gestapo, but their existence provided hope for those desperate to defy the regime. Gangl's overtures were met with suspicion at first, for Wehrmacht officers were rarely seen as allies. Yet his sincerity and his willingness to risk his own career and life gradually convinced them. Through whispered meetings in barns, church cellars, and forest clearings, the outlines of cooperation began to take shape. Gangl promised to protect Wehrmacht's civilians from SS reprisals, even if it meant turning his guns against fellow Germans. He offered intelligence about Wehrmacht and SS movements, information the resistance desperately needed. In return, the resistance provided him with contacts that stretched beyond the valleys, connecting to broader anti-Nazi efforts across Austria. Together, they forged a fragile alliance built on necessity and trust. Each step deeper into this network marked Gangl's transformation from soldier of Hitler to soldier of conscience. His betrayal of the Reich was now complete, and his destiny tied to the fate of the Tyrol. The risk to Gangl was immense, for the SS were always watching, and desertion meant execution without trial. His men too faced mortal danger if their commander's intentions were discovered. Yet Gangl's leadership inspired loyalty, and many of his soldiers chose to follow his path. They had fought together, suffered together, and now they shared disillusionment together. He explained to them that the war was lost, that continuing to fight was not bravery but madness, and that their duty was now to protect civilians from destruction. His men listened, and slowly a small but determined band of Wehrmacht soldiers came under his guidance. They were no longer defenders of the Reich, but guardians of a single town and its people. Armed with artillery and rifles, they became a shield against the SS. Gangl's position gave him authority, but his moral clarity gave him power. In Wehrmacht, civilians whispered his name with cautious hope, recognizing in him a rare German officer who had chosen compassion. The SS, however, would not tolerate such defiance if discovered. Gangl's defiance was therefore a race against time, each day bringing liberation closer but danger ever nearer. As the Allies advanced into Austria, the urgency of Gangl's mission grew. Reports indicated that American forces were pushing through Bavaria, their tanks rolling across the last natural defenses of the Reich. The question was not if they would arrive in Tyrol, but when. For the people of Wehrmacht, survival depended on holding out until the Allies appeared. Yet the SS threatened to turn the valleys into killing grounds before surrender could occur. Gangl realized that his alliance with local resistance was not enough. He would need to reach out directly to the advancing Americans. The decision was extraordinary, a Wehrmacht officer preparing to negotiate with the enemy while his own side still officially fought on. But to Gangl, there was no contradiction. Germany's leaders had abandoned reason, and only cooperation with the Allies could save lives. The act would brand him a traitor in the eyes of the Reich, but a hero to those who would survive because of him. For a man trained to obey orders without question, it was a transformation of conscience. His choice reflected not only military pragmatism, but the triumph of humanity over fanaticism. That triumph would soon converge with the strange fate of Castle Itter. Gangl's contacts with resistance members paved the way for a daring step, the search for direct Allied assistance. He encouraged villagers to send out messengers, risking capture to bring word to American patrols moving through Bavaria. At the same time, he began gathering intelligence about SS positions in the region, preparing to offer it in exchange for protection. His soldiers stood guard against SS incursions, turning their weapons toward those who had once been their comrades. The line between friend and foe blurred completely, leaving only the stark division between those who clung to tyranny and those who sought survival. For Gangl, the transformation was deeply personal, a rebirth from soldier of the Reich to protector of innocence. The villagers, once fearful of any man in uniform, began to see his presence as a shield. His reputation grew not from conquest or rank, but from courage in defiance of the SS. This alliance of Wehrmacht stragglers and Austrian civilians was fragile, but it embodied the strange contradictions of war's end. Every whispered plan, every guarded movement brought them closer to contact with the Americans. And in that contact lay the hope of survival, not just for Welg, but for Castle Itter itself. Josef Gangl's decision was as rare as it was dangerous, for few Wehrmacht officers dared to act so boldly in the final days of the Reich. His choice to stand with civilians against the SS and toward cooperation with the Allies made him both an enemy of his own regime and a potential ally of his former foes. It was an act born of conscience, forged by the brutality of war and the collapse of illusions. In those days of May 1945, Gangl embodied the possibility that even within the ranks of Germany's military, humanity could survive tyranny. His plea for help, whispered first to villagers and then prepared for the Americans, would soon bring together an alliance no one could have imagined. Within days, German soldiers, French prisoners, Austrian resistance members, and American troops would find themselves united in a single cause. Castle Itter, looming in the Tyrolean Alps, would become the unlikely stage for this alliance. Gangl's decision was the spark that set the improbable sequence of events into motion. In choosing humanity over ideology, he altered not only his fate, but the fate of all within the castle. His plea for help was not just a request, it was a declaration of resistance against tyranny itself, and it would echo through the strangest battle of the Second World War. Within the stone walls of Castle Itter, the French VIP prisoners understood that their fate was bound to the chaos outside. The SS guards who had once enforced order were now unreliable, some fleeing, others growing more violent as the Reich collapsed. Fear ran through the castle, for liberation seemed near, but remained frustratingly out of reach. Among the prisoners, one man emerged as a figure of quiet determination, a Yugoslav political prisoner known only as Zoonder. Unlike the French dignitaries, Zoonder was not celebrated for political office or military rank. He was a man hardened by hardship, a survivor of camps and prisons, and his resilience gave him an edge others lacked. In whispers exchanged in the barracks, the idea grew that someone must attempt escape to seek outside help. The risks were enormous. SS patrols roamed the countryside, and the forests were filled with retreating German units who shot suspected deserters or partisans on sight. Yet without external intervention, the French prisoners feared they would be executed before the Americans could arrive. Zoonder listened, observed, and decided he would take the burden upon himself. He would attempt the impossible to slip past the castle's defences and carry news of their plight to the advancing allies. The night of his escape was one of tense silence, broken only by the wind that rustled through the Tyrolean trees. Zoonder prepared with almost nothing, no map, no compass, no weapon, only the determination etched into his every step. He studied the castle guards' routines, noting when fatigue made them careless, when watchtowers turned their gaze away from the outer walls. Every creak of the stones beneath his feet threatened discovery, every shadow could conceal betrayal. Crawling through a narrow gap near the outer wall, he slipped into the darkness of the forest. Behind him Castle Itter loomed like a prison and fortress combined, its lights flickering in the cold night air. Ahead stretched miles of dangerous countryside controlled by forces both fleeing and fanatical. Zoonder's heartbeat quickened, not from fear alone, but from the weight of responsibility he carried. The lives of the French statesmen, generals and dignitaries now depended on his ability to endure. One misstep, one careless encounter, and his mission would end in silence and death. Yet Zoonder pressed on, driven by the urgency of survival and the flickering hope of rescue. The countryside of Tyrol in May 1945 was a land in turmoil where every farmstead and crossroads bore the scars of war. Retreating Wehrmacht soldiers trudged along muddy paths, some still loyal, others broken by defeat. Fanatical SS units prowled for deserters, setting ambushes and shooting without hesitation. Zoonder moved cautiously, always staying near tree lines, never daring to cross open fields unless the night cloaked him in darkness. He relied on his instincts honed in years of captivity, listening for unnatural sounds, watching for glints of steel or sudden movements. Villages lay eerily silent, their residents hiding indoors, unsure whether surrender or violence awaited them. More than once, Zoonder caught the distant sound of gunfire, a reminder that the war was ending violently even here in these valleys. His throat burned with thirst, but he dared not approach wells or barns, fearing betrayal or capture. Hunger gnawed at him, yet his willpower pushed him forward. Each step carried him further from the stone walls of Castle Itter, yet closer to the unknown dangers of the wider war zone. Survival meant never stopping, never lingering, for hesitation was as deadly as a bullet. By dawn Zoonder's legs ached from the punishing pace, but he pressed forward through forest thick with pine and undergrowth. He hid among boulders when he heard the clatter of vehicles, German convoys still retreating, desperate to escape the Allied advance. He knew that if captured he would be branded a partisan and executed on the spot. The terrain itself was merciless, with steep inclines and rocky paths, threatening to twist an ankle or worse. Yet the natural world also offered cover, with dense woods concealing him from wandering eyes. He scavenged for berries, roots, and even sipped from muddy streams to keep moving. At times despair flickered in his heart as exhaustion weighed down his body. But the thought of the French prisoners, old, weary, yet still clinging to life, renewed his strength. He imagined their faces, their whispered encouragements, their silent prayers for his success. Each vision carried him further, binding his struggle to theirs. For Zoonder the escape was no longer about his survival alone, but about delivering salvation to those still trapped in Castle Itter. The journey brought him into contact with the fractured remnants of the Reich's forces. In one village he observed SS troops bullying locals, their uniforms ragged but their cruelty undiminished. He dared not intervene, for discovery meant death, but the sight reinforced the urgency of his mission. Elsewhere, he stumbled upon the bodies of deserters hanged from trees, grim warnings left as the Reich consumed itself. These scenes seared into his mind, reminders that cruelty persisted even in collapse. Zoonder skirted roads, hiding in ditches when trucks roared past, their engines sputtering with dwindling fuel. He moved mostly at night, guided by the stars and his memory of the landscape. During the day he sought shelter in barns or abandoned cottages, always alert to the possibility of betrayal. His journey was not only physical but psychological, a battle against fear, exhaustion, and despair. At times his body screamed for rest, but the thought of Castle Itter kept him moving. His mission had become a thread of hope binding him to the prisoners and ultimately to history. Finally, after days of peril, Zoonder began to sense the shifting tides of war in the air. The thunder of artillery grew closer, not distant, and the skies above echoed with the roar of Allied aircraft. The once dominant swastika banners had disappeared from many villages, replaced by silence or cautious relief. He encountered villagers who whispered of Americans nearby, of tanks moving through Bavaria, of liberation creeping ever closer. Each rumor spurred him onward, even as fatigue nearly broke his body. His ragged appearance drew wary glances, but he avoided direct contact, fearing betrayal from those still loyal to the Reich. At last he heard the unmistakable sound of engines not of German origin, the deep rumble of Allied armor moving across the roads. His heart pounded, for the moment of connection was near. He crawled from cover, waving his arms desperately, knowing a single mistake could make him a target. American soldiers, wary of traps, raised their weapons as he stumbled forward, but through broken German and gestures, Zoonder conveyed his plea for help. Castle Itter, he explained, held prisoners whose lives depended on immediate rescue. The Americans, hardened by months of combat, listened with skepticism at first. They had heard rumors of strange encounters in the Alps, but rarely of castles filled with French dignitaries. Yet Zoonder's desperation, his wounds, and his exhaustion spoke of authenticity. He described the prisoners, naming French leaders of renown, former prime ministers, generals, and statesmen. The soldiers, recognizing the importance of such figures, realized the gravity of his tale. Word was quickly passed up the chain of command, drawing the attention of officers tasked with advancing into Tyrol. Reports matched with intelligence that had hinted at unusual prisoners held in Austria. For the Americans, this was no ordinary mission. It was a chance to rescue high-value captives from almost certain death. Zoonder's courage had delivered them the key. His trek, carved from desperation and hope, now bore fruit in the form of potential salvation. The Americans promised to act, preparing to send help toward the castle in the Alps. For the first time since slipping into the night, Zoonder allowed himself the faintest glimmer of relief. Zoonder's escape had changed the balance of fate at Castle Itter. The French prisoners, waiting anxiously behind their walls, did not yet know that salvation was moving toward them. In the darkness of the forest, a single man's courage had bridged the gap between despair and hope. His trek through hostile territory, his endurance through hunger and exhaustion, had ensured that the story of Castle Itter would not end in silence. Without maps, without weapons, without allies, he had crossed the killing fields of a dying Reich. His determination gave the Americans the knowledge they needed to intervene at precisely the right moment. History would later remember the battle that followed as one of the strangest of the war, but its foundation was built upon his footsteps. Zoonder's name may not have echoed with the fame of generals or prime ministers, but his role was no less vital. He was the messenger of life, the courier of hope, the one who refused to accept inevitable death. In his escape, he proved that even in the darkest hours of war, a single act of courage could alter destiny, and that destiny was now marching toward Castle Itter, carried on the treads of American tanks. When Zoonder stumbled into the presence of the advancing American forces, His appearance alone told a story of exhaustion and desperation. His clothing was torn from crawling through forests and fields, his face gaunt with hunger, and his words tumbled out in a mixture of broken German, fragments of French, and frantic gestures. At first, the American soldiers of the 12th Armored Division were cautious, for they had been trained to expect deception in these final chaotic days of the war. The rumors of German stragglers using false stories to ambush advancing units were still fresh in their minds. Weapons were leveled at him, eyes narrowed with suspicion, and orders were barked for him to keep his hands visible. Yet beneath the exhaustion there was urgency in his voice that could not be faked. He spoke of French prime ministers, generals, and cultural figures trapped within a castle guarded by hostile SS. The strangeness of the tale made it sound like fantasy, but the specific names Daladier, Renaud, Weygand, and Gamelin struck chords of recognition. The Americans, hardened by months of war, knew that if even part of the story was true, it demanded attention. Slowly their skepticism began to melt, replaced by curiosity and growing resolve. What they had first suspected as a trick began to feel like a mission of extraordinary significance. The officer in charge, cautious but intrigued, ordered Zoonder escorted to the rear for questioning by interpreters. Inside a makeshift command tent, lit by dim lanterns and filled with maps of Austria and Bavaria, the Yugoslav prisoner laid out everything he knew. He explained the layout of Castle Itter, the identity of the prisoners, and the presence of dangerous SS elements still lurking nearby. His words painted a picture of high-value captives at risk of execution, trapped in the crumbling edifice of Hitler's Reich. The Americans listened carefully, balancing the urgency of his plea against the risks of committing men to an unusual rescue. As intelligence officers cross-referenced his testimony, they realized that Allied command had indeed received fragmentary reports of prominent French figures being held in Austria. The story, bizarre as it was, began to line up with existing intelligence. Zoonder's emaciated figure, trembling from fatigue, was given food and water, though his mind remained fixed on the castle. He urged them again and again that time was short, that the SS might at any moment decide to liquidate the prisoners. His insistence, his sincerity, and his sheer endurance gave his story the ring of undeniable truth. By the end of the debriefing, the Americans were convinced they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The decision now fell upon elements of the 12th Armored Division, supported by infantry from nearby units, to investigate the claim. War had taught them to be cautious, but it had also taught them to seize opportunities quickly. Officers weighed the risks. An isolated castle, possibly filled with SS, could be a trap or a bloodbath. But the potential prize, the rescue of prominent Allied political leaders, was too significant to ignore. One officer remarked that if the story was true, history would judge their response for generations. The men, many still weary from days of marching and fighting, now found themselves staring at a mission unlike any they had encountered. Their duty had shifted from storming towns and clearing forests to liberating what sounded more like a medieval fortress than a battlefield objective. Tanks rumbled into readiness, infantry checked their weapons, and scouts plotted the approach routes. Soldiers traded incredulous looks, muttering about rescuing French prime ministers from a German castle. Yet behind the disbelief was a sense of excitement, for they felt they were on the verge of writing an extraordinary page of history. For once their mission was not only about defeating the enemy, but about saving lives of global importance. Meanwhile, Josef Gangl, the disillusioned Wehrmacht major, who had already resolved to protect Tyrolean civilians, found his path converging with the Americans. Gangl and his men, equally disgusted with the fanaticism of the SS, saw in the Americans a chance to act with honor in the Reich's dying hours. It was Gangl's scouts who first made cautious contact with the US forces, waving white flags and approaching nervously across a valley road. The Americans, wary of deception, kept their weapons at the ready, but quickly realized these German soldiers had no intent to fight. Instead, Gangl explained the situation in clear terms. He had French VIP prisoners trapped at Castle Itter, civilians in danger, and SS units threatening both. His words mirrored Zoonder's story, now giving the Americans corroboration from a highly unusual source. The idea of fighting alongside German soldiers against the SS was almost unthinkable, yet the circumstances left little room for doubt. American officers, exchanging astonished glances, recognized the strangeness of the alliance taking shape. A Wehrmacht officer and an escaped Yugoslav prisoner were both pleading for the same cause. In that moment, the surreal fabric of the final days of the war began to weave a new and improbable alliance. The Americans agreed to march with Gangl, an act that would make this battle one of history's strangest. The Americans, however, demanded proof of Gangl's intentions before fully committing. They asked blunt questions, probing his loyalty, wondering if he might be leading them into an ambush. Gangl, standing tall in his worn uniform, swore that he and his men had no allegiance to Hitler's collapsing Reich. He spoke instead of protecting civilians from SS reprisals and saving the prisoners who had become hostages of circumstance. His sincerity was clear, not only in words but in his willingness to stand beside the Americans unarmed. Slowly, the tension between former enemies began to ease, replaced by a tentative trust born of necessity. Soldiers who had once been taught to kill each other now found themselves bound by a common cause. The Americans saw in Gangl not a Nazi, but a soldier bound by conscience, ready to defy the regime he had once served. Gangl, in turn, recognized the Americans as not conquerors, but potential allies in his final act of duty. It was a fragile alliance, but one forged in urgency and desperation. Together they resolved to advance toward Castle Itter, prepared to fight the SS side by side. In this fragile understanding lay the seeds of a battle unlike any other in World War II. The plan that emerged was both simple and daring. A small American armored detachment, supported by infantry and joined by Gangl's Wehrmacht men, would move toward the castle with all possible speed. Time was critical, for every delay increased the risk that the SS would massacre the prisoners. Scouts reported enemy patrols still operating in the surrounding hills, meaning resistance was certain. The Americans loaded their vehicles, their Sherman tanks and half-tracks ready to push into the Alpine valleys. Gangl's men, some armed with captured weapons and little ammunition, fell into formation alongside them. To the astonishment of many, German soldiers now rode in American vehicles, sharing cigarettes with men who only weeks earlier had been bitter enemies. The surreal nature of the mission was not lost on anyone, but necessity overruled disbelief. Maps were spread on tank hulls, showing the winding roads that led to the castle's gates. The men studied their objectives carefully, understanding that a direct assault might be required. At dawn, the column began to move, the sound of engines echoing off the mountainsides. This small improvised force carried with it the hopes of statesmen, civilians, and soldiers united in one improbable cause. For the French prisoners waiting inside Castle Itter, the alliance forming beyond their walls was unimaginable. They had resigned themselves to a grim fate, believing liberation might never come. Yet now, far away, American soldiers and disillusioned Wehrmacht troops were preparing to fight for them. Zoonder's desperate gamble had succeeded beyond measure, bringing together allies no one could have predicted. The irony was profound, former enemies marching together to save men who had once governed France. In that strange coalition lay the essence of Castle Itter's legend. The Americans, pragmatic and focused, saw the mission as both a rescue and a symbolic gesture. Gangl and his Germans saw it as redemption, a chance to cleanse their honor before the war's end. The French prisoners, still unaware of these developments, clung to hope in silence. The SS forces, meanwhile, continued to lurk, unaware of the storm gathering against them. Every mile the Americans advanced brought them closer to the confrontation that history would later call World War II's strangest battle. And as the column pressed on, the weight of destiny seemed to press on every man involved. Thus, in the Alpine valleys of Austria, an alliance was born that defied the logic of war. Americans and Wehrmacht troops, guided by the courage of a Yugoslav escape, prepared to march on Castle Itter. The soldiers themselves knew they were part of something extraordinary, a mission that broke every expectation of how enemies should behave. Cigarettes were passed, nervous jokes exchanged, and wary glances softened into trust. For Gangl, this was a final stand for honor. For the Americans, a rescue mission with global implications. For Zoonder, it was proof that his impossible journey had not been in vain. The French prisoners remained unaware that rescue was on its way, their names and legacies about to be preserved by strangers and former foes. History in this moment was no longer about national divides, but about humanity rising against tyranny. The SS, cruel and fanatical to the end, would soon meet a coalition they could never have imagined. The 12th Armored Division's column rolled onward, engines growling as dawn broke across the mountains. The mission was set, the alliances forged, and the stage prepared. Ahead lay Castle Itter, and the battle that would forever be remembered as the strangest of the Second World War. The meeting of Josef Gangl, the battle-hardened Wehrmacht major, and Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., the brash and resourceful American officer, was an encounter no one could have predicted. Gangl, who had once fought under Hitler's banners, now stood disillusioned and determined to save lives rather than take them. Lee, known for his boldness and willingness to take risks, saw in this German officer not an enemy but a potential ally in a desperate cause. Their first exchange was cautious, words clipped and deliberate, both men measuring the other's sincerity. Yet within moments the truth was clear. Both despised the fanaticism of the SS and were willing to stand shoulder to shoulder against it. Gangl explained the peril at Castle Itter. French dignitaries held hostage, SS units preparing to strike, and civilians caught in the crossfire. Lee, though incredulous, grasped the urgency and understood the symbolic value of such a rescue. In that instant, the boundaries of nationality, uniform, and ideology seemed to blur in the face of shared humanity. The handshake that followed was not just a gesture of agreement, but a pact sealed in necessity and honor. For the first time, German Wehrmacht and American forces pledged to fight together. History had pivoted toward one of its most extraordinary moments. Lee's men, battle-tested but wary, struggled to comprehend the sight of German soldiers standing alongside them. For years, they had been trained to see every man in Feldgrau as a sworn enemy, a figure to be defeated, captured, or killed. Yet here was Major Gangl, calm, resolute, and willing to risk everything for prisoners and villagers alike. Lee, in his characteristic blunt style, told his men that the war was no longer about abstract lines, but about saving lives. Today, he explained, our allies wear different uniforms, but our enemies are the same fanatics who would kill the helpless. Slowly, disbelief gave way to determination among the American troops. Gangl, in turn, addressed his small group of Germans, men who had followed him out of loyalty, not ideology. He made it clear that their mission was not for the Reich, but for humanity and redemption. The Americans and Germans exchanged wary glances, then tentative nods, recognizing the necessity of trust. Cigarettes were passed between men who, only days earlier, might have shot each other without hesitation. In those moments, an unlikely bond began to form across the most improbable of divides. The planning of the castle's defense began with urgency, for the SS would not delay forever. Gangl provided intelligence on the terrain, describing the winding approach roads and the vantage points from which attacks might come. Lee sketched maps across tank hulls, his mind racing with calculations of fields of fire, choke points, and fallback positions. Together they studied the castle's structure, a medieval fortress with thick stone walls, but also vulnerabilities that modern weaponry could exploit. The Americans brought Sherman tanks and heavy machine guns, while Gangl's men contributed rifles, mortars, and their intimate knowledge of German tactics. They understood that the SS would attack with fury, desperate to erase witnesses and punish defection. Ammunition was scarce, manpower limited, but courage filled the void where resources faltered. Lee and Gangl decided to fortify the castle's gates, position tanks at the strongest approaches, and create overlapping fields of fire to maximize their defensive capability. The French prisoners themselves were briefed on the plan, and though dignitaries unused to combat, they offered to help however they could. Within hours, the outlines of a defensive alliance unlike any other in the war were drawn. The defenders of Castle Itter were ready to face the storm. Despite the urgency, the strangeness of the alliance was not lost on anyone involved. American soldiers found themselves drilling side by side with German Wehrmacht men, their accents clashing, but their intent aligned. Gangl's men, stripped of Nazi symbols, seemed almost relieved to fight for something meaningful at last. Lee, known for his sharp tongue, cracked jokes to lighten the tension, remarking that he had never thought he would see Germans covering his flank. The French prisoners, watching from the castle windows, marveled at the surreal sight of sworn enemies preparing together for battle. Former prime ministers and generals muttered in disbelief, yet also with gratitude, for salvation now seemed tangible. The castle's medieval towers echoed with the sound of sandbags being stacked, machine guns mounted, and ammunition crates dragged into position. Strategy meetings were held in vaulted halls where prisoners had once dined in fear. Outside, patrols set traps and scouted the surrounding hills for signs of SS movement. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of anxiety and determination, as men from opposing sides of the war prepared to fight together. History was unfolding in real time within those stone walls. Major Gangl's transformation from soldier of the Reich to defender of innocence was perhaps the most striking element of this alliance. For years he had fought battles dictated by a dictator's madness, yet now he was guided by conscience and duty to protect. He reassured villagers from nearby towns, promising them safety within the castle's shadow. Civilians, once terrified of both uniforms, now brought food, water, and information to the defenders. For the Americans, this solidarity from the locals reinforced the righteousness of their mission. Lee, pragmatic yet moved, recognized Gangl as a man of honor despite the uniform he wore. They spoke late into the night about tactics, but also about the futility of war and the desire for peace. Gangl admitted his disgust for Hitler's regime, confessing that this fight was his final chance to set things right. Lee, though skeptical of most Germans, found himself respecting the major's resolve. Their shared conviction grew into something stronger than convenience. It became trust, and in that trust lay the fragile foundation upon which the defense of Castle Itter would rest. The practicalities of defense consumed the next hours with feverish activity. Sandbags lined windows, where sharpshooters would lie in wait. Tanks were maneuvered into positions where their cannons could sweep the approach roads. The castle's gates were reinforced with whatever wood and steel could be scavenged, while civilians helped prepare barricades. Ammunition was rationed carefully, with each soldier aware that resupply was unlikely in the heat of battle. Lee's Americans checked radio sets, attempting to maintain contact with higher command, though interference in the mountains was constant. Gangl's Germans dug trenches along key ridges, their shovels scraping into the hard alpine soil. The French dignitaries, though untrained, insisted on carrying supplies, filling sandbags, and assisting with basic preparations. Every man and woman in the castle understood that survival would depend on unity and resourcefulness. The old walls, once symbols of imprisonment, were now bastions of resistance. Night fell over Castle Itter, with the defenders readying themselves for the inevitable clash. They knew the SS would come with vengeance, but they were determined to make the fortress a stand for humanity. Conversations around campfires and in shadowed hallways revealed the depth of the alliance's significance. American soldiers asked Gangl's men why they had chosen this path, and the Germans spoke openly of shame, disillusionment, and redemption. For many, this battle was their chance to defy the tyranny they had once served, to fight not for Hitler but against him. Lee's men, though cautious, began to accept their former enemies as comrades in arms. Jokes were exchanged, hands shaken, and the atmosphere shifted from suspicion to camaraderie. The French prisoners, astonished at the unity forming, began to hope that this extraordinary bond might hold long enough to save them. In whispered conversations, some admitted that they had never believed salvation would come in such a form. The medieval stone halls became echo chambers of laughter, planning, and anticipation. Tension remained high, but it was tempered by the realization that something extraordinary was happening. Men who should have been divided by blood and history were instead united by conscience and necessity. It was a fragile alliance, but it was real, and it was about to be tested by fire. Thus, Castle Itter stood on the brink of a battle that would defy every convention of the Second World War. Within its walls, Americans, Wehrmacht defectors, French dignitaries, and local civilians were bound together by a shared mission. Their weapons were few, their numbers limited, but their resolve was absolute. Josef, Gangl, and Jack Lee, men from opposite sides of a brutal war, now stood side by side as brothers in arms. Together, they had forged a pact that no one outside those walls could have imagined. The defense they planned was more than a tactical arrangement. It was a statement of defiance against tyranny and fanaticism. Every rifle positioned, every sandbag stacked, was an act of defiance against the SS machine. The French prisoners, once resigned to death, now felt the flicker of hope growing into a flame, and as the night deepened, the men in the castle steeled themselves for the coming storm. The strange alliance had been formed, and its members were ready to write their place in history. The Battle of Castle Itter, the strangest of the war, was about to begin in earnest. Inside the ancient walls of Castle Itter, the French VIP prisoners lived in a strange limbo between luxury and captivity. Among them were men whose names had once defined France's destiny, former Prime Ministers Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, General Maxime Weygand, General Maurice Gamelin, and prominent political figures like Léon Jouhaux, the trade union leader. These men were accustomed to command, to addressing parliaments and armies, not to living under SS supervision in a remote Austrian fortress. Their cells were not the dank barracks of a concentration camp, but the castle's chambers, still cold, still guarded, still suffused with fear. Meals were basic but not starvation rations, yet every bite carried the taste of uncertainty. They walked the courtyards under watchful eyes, their conversations hushed, their rivalries simmering just beneath the surface. Some found solace in books or improvised discussions on politics, history, and the war's course. Others brooded in silence, their thoughts circling around lost power, betrayal, and uncertain futures. The irony of their captivity weighed heavily. Men who had once shaped nations now reduced to hostages of a collapsing Reich. Every day inside Castle Itter deepened their awareness that survival depended on forces beyond their control, and in their uneasy community, tensions brewed as much from old rivalries as from present dangers. Edouard Daladier, remembered for his role in the Munich Agreement of 1938, carried the burden of appeasement like a shadow that never left him. His presence among the prisoners provoked both respect for his political career and disdain for the decisions that many believed had weakened France before the war. Paul Reynaud, his successor as Prime Minister, was equally controversial, admired for his determination to resist Germany, but criticized for his inability to unify the French government in 1940. These two figures, once locked in political battle, now found themselves confined within the same stone walls, forced to share the humiliations of captivity. General Weygand, the respected but aging commander, brought with him the aura of a soldier of the old guard, his stiff demeanor masking his inner torment. General Gamelin, by contrast, was remembered for France's catastrophic defeat in 1940, and his very presence rekindled bitter debates about blame. Conversations around the dinner table sometimes turned into sharp exchanges, voices rising as old wounds reopened. The French dignitaries could not fully set aside their rivalries, even in the shadow of death, yet paradoxically, their very disagreements gave them vitality, a reminder of the political struggles that had once defined their world. Castle Itter became not only a prison, but a microcosm of French politics in exile. Despite their differences, all of the French prisoners shared one common reality. Their fate rested entirely in the hands of their captors. The SS guards treated them with alternating indifference and menace, sometimes mocking their prominence, other times threatening them with execution. The prisoners, though far from front lines, felt the war pressing closer each day in the sounds of distant artillery and the rumors carried by guards. Some clung to optimism, convinced that liberation was imminent as Allied armies closed in on Austria. Others sank into despair, haunted by the possibility that the SS might massacre them in a final act of cruelty. Tension between hope and fear defined their daily existence, seeping into every conversation and gesture. Even the castle's grand rooms, with their carved beams and stone fireplaces, could not disguise that these men were hostages of the Reich. They debated constantly, not only about politics and blame, but about whether they would live to see France free again. At times their disputes were so heated that guards looked on with amusement, entertained by the spectacle of French leaders quarreling in captivity. For the prisoners, the walls of Castle Itter magnified their rivalries, trapping them together without escape. Their shared confinement became both a bond and a battlefield. Amid these quarrels, certain figures emerged as stabilizers, voices of reason in a sea of discord. Léon Jouhaux, the Nobel Peace Prize-winning trade unionist, tried to bridge divides by reminding his fellow captives of the importance of unity in adversity. Others, like General Weygand, attempted to impose military discipline on discussions, insisting on order and calm even as tempers flared. Yet Daladier and Reynaud, still unwilling to forgive or forget, often clashed, their exchanges reflecting years of political rivalry and personal animosity. The irony was stark. Men who had failed to unite France in its darkest hour were now called upon to unite for their own survival. The prisoners recognized the absurdity of their situation, and some even joked bitterly that their quarrels were as dangerous as the SS. Still, the shared threat forced compromises, however temporary, as they realized that division could only weaken them. Their debates ranged from strategy for post-war France to the question of whether they should take up arms if an opportunity arose. Each man carried not only his past reputation, but the burden of his decisions etched into the judgment of his peers. Castle Itter's cold halls became the stage for arguments that echoed like parliamentary sessions in miniature. Yet beneath it all lay a fragile thread of solidarity, woven from necessity. The French dignitaries were not passive spectators. They watched events unfold with the eyes of statesmen accustomed to weighing risks. They noted the shifting behavior of their guards, the nervous glances, the growing sense of Reich collapse. When whispers reached them of German soldiers defecting or surrendering, their imaginations caught fire with the possibility of liberation. Still, they feared betrayal, for the SS were known for massacres of prisoners in the war's final days. Reynaud, pragmatic and sharp, insisted that they prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Daladier, often defensive, countered with arguments that survival depended solely on external rescue. Weygand and Gamelin, veterans of military planning, discussed potential defensive measures, though they had no weapons to implement them. Their political rivalries, though ever present, gave way at times to sober recognition of their shared danger. They began to imagine themselves not just as victims, but as participants in whatever drama might unfold. The castle had become a crucible, testing not only their patience but their courage. In those hours, the French prisoners rediscovered a sense of agency, however limited. Their fate might lie beyond the walls, but their will to resist was rekindling within them. The prisoners' awareness of the outside world grew sharper when they observed small signs of change in their captors. Guards whispered of Allied tanks moving closer, of SS units retreating into the mountains, of villages changing hands. The French dignitaries seized on every fragment of news, analyzing it like statesmen poring over dispatches in Paris. Their debates took on renewed vigor, as if liberation itself depended on their arguments. Some prisoners allowed themselves optimism, imagining triumphant returns to France. Others, scarred by years of defeat and exile, dismissed such hopes as dangerous illusions. Yet even their pessimism carried a strange vitality, for it reminded them that they were still men with opinions, not just prisoners awaiting execution. The clash of optimism and despair created a rhythm to their days, a pendulum swinging between hope and fear. Their tempers sometimes frayed, but in their unity of circumstance, even rivals found themselves bound together. In their own way, these French leaders were preparing mentally for the moment when fate would call upon them, and that moment was approaching faster than they realized. Their role in the coming defense of Castle Itter was uncertain but undeniable. Though untrained in modern warfare, these men were seasoned in politics and command, their instincts tuned to leadership. When Josef Gangl and Jack Lee briefed them on the alliance forming outside, they listened intently, some skeptical, others exhilarated. Reynaud quickly grasped the strangeness of the situation: Americans and Wehrmacht troops preparing to fight the SS to protect Frenchmen. Daladier muttered darkly about irony, yet even he recognized the necessity of cooperation. Weygand, the old general, straightened his posture, declaring that they must assist however they could. The prisoners pledged to support the defense by carrying ammunition, building barricades, or even picking up weapons if the battle came to their doorstep. Their rivalries did not vanish, but they were momentarily eclipsed by the gravity of the situation. They understood that their survival was not guaranteed, but their participation might tilt the balance. Castle Itter had transformed them from hostages into reluctant defenders, and in that transformation, their political legacies intersected with their personal courage. Thus, within the walls of Castle Itter, the French VIP prisoners embodied both the divisions and the resilience of their nation. Their rivalries mirrored the fractures that had doomed France in 1940, but their endurance reflected the will that had carried it through centuries of crisis. In captivity, they rediscovered the necessity of unity. however fragile, when confronted with mortal danger. Their arguments, though heated, revealed men still alive, still engaged, still unwilling to surrender to despair. The presence of American and German allies outside offered them a chance to reclaim dignity, to prove that even in chains they had a role to play. They became not only symbols of France's past, but participants in a story that would echo into its future. The irony was profound. Men who had once led armies and governments now awaited rescue by soldiers who had been enemies days before. Yet history is full of such ironies, and Castle Itter would soon become a stage where all of them collided. The French dignitaries were no longer just prisoners. They were central figures in an alliance that defied the logic of war. Their presence gave the defense of Castle Itter not only military urgency, but political significance, and in their survival, the legacy of France itself would be preserved. The approach of the American tanks was felt before it was seen, their engines growling through the narrow alpine roads as dawn light spilled across the valley. Villagers peeked from shuttered windows, astonished to see Shermans rumbling side by side with German Wehrmacht trucks. Inside Castle Itter, the French dignitaries rushed to the windows at the first distant clatter of armor, their hearts leaping with cautious hope. At the gates, Major Josef Gangl and Captain John C. Jack Lee stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to greet the column. When the tanks finally appeared, dust trailing behind them, it was as if a piece of modern war had collided with the medieval fortress. Lee barked orders for the vehicles to take positions, their turrets swiveling toward possible avenues of attack. Gangl pointed out defensive weak spots in the walls, the gates, and the surrounding slopes. The castle, once a symbol of imprisonment, was now being reborn as a fortress of defiance. Soldiers jumped from half-tracks, rifles at the ready, while Wehrmacht volunteers formed ranks with visible pride. The Surreal alliance grew more tangible as American and German soldiers began working side by side. The French prisoners looked on in awe, hardly believing the spectacle before them. Castle Itter had become the center of a story stranger than fiction. The Americans brought not only firepower, but discipline and confidence that bolstered the morale of everyone inside. The sight of Sherman tanks stationed at the castle's approaches reassured the prisoners that they were no longer defenseless pawns. Infantry squads spread across the grounds, establishing firing lines and setting up machine gun nests on the walls. German volunteers under Gangl mirrored their actions, dragging sandbags, unspooling barbed wire, and carrying crates of ammunition. The division of labor dissolved old enmities, uniforms blurred into a common effort to survive. Lee, his cigar clenched between his teeth, strode through the courtyard with characteristic energy, checking positions and shouting encouragement. Gangl remained calm and methodical, conferring with his men in low tones, then translating tactical needs into German precision. Between them, the fortress came alive with the hum of preparation. The French dignitaries, though unused to soldiering, carried supplies and fetched water, eager to contribute to their own salvation. Even the castle's civilian staff, cooks and attendants, joined in building barricades at the windows. The sense of impending battle bound everyone together in a shared purpose. For the first time, the prisoners felt that Castle Itter could truly withstand the storm. Transforming the castle into a defensible fortress required ingenuity, as well as determination. Its medieval walls, though thick, had gaps that modern explosives could exploit, and its gates were vulnerable to concentrated fire. Lee ordered the Shermans positioned where their cannons could cover the main road, creating a steel shield at the castle's most obvious entry point. Gangl supervised his men as they constructed fallback barricades in the inner courtyard, layers of defense should the outer gates fail. Machine gun nests were placed in towers, giving overlapping arcs of fire across the approaches. Soldiers hauled furniture from the castle's halls to reinforce windows, fashioning makeshift firing positions. Ammunition was stacked carefully, rationed so that every bullet would count. Engineers worked to fortify the drawbridge and lay down obstacles that might slow an SS advance. Inside the walls, corridors were mapped for choke points, should fighting spill into the castle itself. Every man, French dignitary or hardened soldier, knew exactly where he was to go if the alarm sounded. By the end of the day, the fortress that had once been a prison had been reborn as a bastion prepared for siege. The alliance was strengthened not only by preparation but by the strange camaraderie that developed among the defenders. Americans traded rations with German volunteers, laughing awkwardly as they passed chocolate bars and cigarettes. Wehrmacht soldiers, relieved to have broken free of the Reich's poisonous grasp, found themselves treated not as enemies but as comrades. Even the French prisoners marveled at the transformation, remarking that they had never believed they would see German and American troops working side by side. Lee and Gangl often walked the ramparts together, pointing to distant ridges where SS troops might appear, their shared purpose erasing years of hostility. In the evenings, campfires burned in the courtyard, the soldiers resting with rifles across their knees as voices mingled in different tongues. Though suspicion lingered in some glances, necessity forged bonds that diplomacy never could. Every man knew that when the SS came, trust would mean survival. The French prisoners joined these moments too, telling stories of politics and exile, drawing laughter even from weary soldiers. For a brief time the walls of Castle Itter seemed to hold not just fear, but solidarity. The fortress was no longer only stone and mortar, it was a living community forged in defiance. Still, the mood was not without tension, for every sound from the forests carried the threat of the enemy. Scouts reported movements in the valleys, shadows of SS units regrouping in the woods. The defenders expected an assault at any moment, and the anticipation was more exhausting than battle itself. Soldiers slept in shifts, rifles by their sides, tanks idling in readiness. French prisoners, though they tried to hide it, felt their nerves fray as rumors of approaching fanatics spread. Daladier and Renault argued heatedly one evening about whether the castle could truly hold, their quarrel echoing through the halls. Lee silenced them bluntly, reminding them that survival demanded unity, not division. Gangl calmed the men by speaking of honor, framing their defense as a stand for humanity against barbarism. His words, spoken with quiet dignity, resonated deeply, even with those who once doubted his loyalty. Each man knew that the SS would not hesitate to massacre them all, if given the chance. That knowledge made their preparations not merely tactical, but existential. Castle Itter was now a line drawn against fanaticism itself. The French dignitaries found themselves unexpectedly useful during these tense days of preparation. Some carried supplies or filled sandbags, while others helped maintain morale with conversation and presence. General Weygand and General Gamelin, though old, offered tactical advice, reviewing maps with Gangl and Lee. Their military expertise, though rooted in a different era, still provided perspective on defensive arrangements. Léon Jouhot, ever the conciliator, reminded everyone that survival depended on mutual respect. Even Daladier and Renault, whose bickering often tested patience, eventually took turns carrying crates or keeping watch at windows. Their participation gave them a renewed sense of purpose, easing the humiliation of captivity. It also reassured the soldiers that the prisoners they fought to save would not remain idle in their defense. The atmosphere within the castle shifted from helplessness to grim determination. Every man, whatever his background, was part of the same struggle now. Castle Itter had become less a prison than a fortress of solidarity. The lines between prisoner, soldier, and civilian blurred into a single community bracing for survival. Lee's leadership style contrasted with Gangl's, yet together they complemented each other perfectly. Lee was brash, charismatic, and unafraid to take risks, constantly moving among his men with booming encouragement. Gangl was calm, deliberate, and thoughtful, grounding the defenders with a sense of discipline and resolve. The Americans admired Lee's boldness, while the Germans drew strength from Gangl's quiet honor. Their partnership symbolized the very essence of the alliance, the melding of opposites for a common goal. Decisions were made jointly, with maps spread on tank hulls and strategies argued out under lantern light. The French dignitaries looked on, astonished that former enemies could cooperate so effectively under pressure. Soldiers, regardless of uniform, followed their combined authority without hesitation. Their alliance was practical, but it also carried symbolic weight that lifted morale. If Americans and Germans could fight side by side against the SS, then perhaps there was hope for the world beyond the castle walls. The men believed for the first time that history was being written not in distant capitals, but in the courtyard of Castle Itter. It was a fragile hope, but it burned brightly in the face of looming darkness. As the final barricades were completed and positions reinforced, the defenders of Castle Itter knew the stage was set. The medieval stronghold had been transformed into a fortress of defiance, bristling with tanks, rifles, and determination. The French dignitaries, once helpless hostages, now felt part of the defense, their fate tied to the men preparing to fight. American soldiers adjusted their machine guns, Wehrmacht volunteers checked their rifles, and scouts watched the tree line with narrowed eyes. The air was heavy with expectation, silence broken only by the rumble of tank engines and the scraping of shovels. Night fell over the castle, and the stars above seemed to watch with cold detachment. Somewhere in the forests, SS troops gathered, planning their assault on the fortress that had become a symbol of resistance. Inside the walls, defenders whispered prayers, exchanged handshakes, and steeled themselves for the fight to come. No one knew if reinforcements would arrive in time, or if they would stand alone against overwhelming odds. Yet all understood that their stand carried meaning far beyond their survival. Castle Itter had become a beacon of defiance in the Reich's dying days, and as dawn approached, every man within its walls was ready to face history's strangest battle. As the night deepened across the Tyrolean Alps, the defenders of Castle Itter could sense the storm about to break. Scouts returned breathless, whispering that Waffen SS units had been spotted in the valleys below, their silhouettes moving like shadows among the trees. The reports were grim, hardened SS fanatics, refusing to surrender even as the Reich crumbled, were converging on the isolated fortress. These were not ordinary troops. They were men driven by ideology, vengeance, and the desperation of impending defeat. Their objective was clear: to retake the castle, eliminate its defenders, and slaughter the French dignitaries who symbolized their humiliation. Inside the castle walls, every man understood what such an assault would mean. Ammunition was checked, rifles loaded, and tank engines kept warm in the cool mountain air. Lee ordered his Americans to remain vigilant, their eyes fixed on the forest ridges, while Gangl quietly reassured his German volunteers. Even the French prisoners stood in hushed groups, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like never before. The atmosphere was electric, filled with anticipation, dread, and the knowledge that history itself hung in the balance. Castle Itter had become a fortress waiting for its crucible. The intelligence gathered by scouts painted a terrifying picture of the enemy's strength. Estimates varied, but between 150 and 200 Waffen SS soldiers were believed to be advancing toward the castle. They were well armed, carrying machine guns, mortars, and explosives, determined to crush resistance before the war ended. Many of them belonged to units fleeing north from Italy, veterans who had tasted defeat but still carried the arrogance of their black uniforms. Their commanders knew that the collapse of Germany was inevitable, yet they sought a symbolic act of defiance to stain the final days with blood. For the French dignitaries inside the castle, their names alone made them targets of hatred and revenge. Daladier and Raynor, once leaders of France, were seen as living trophies to be executed in retribution. The SS believed that massacring them would send one final message of terror to the world. In reality, it would only expose the regime's barbarity in its final hours. The knowledge of this looming threat intensified the preparations inside the fortress. The defenders knew they would soon be outnumbered, but not outwilled. Every rifle and every man would count. Captain Lee, ever the soldier of action, called his men together in the courtyard to deliver a stark briefing. He spoke plainly, telling them the enemy would come in force and might attempt to surround the castle before dawn. His words carried no illusions but radiated determination, igniting confidence in weary faces. Gangl, standing beside him, addressed his German volunteers with calm dignity. He told them that though their nation was in ruins, their honor could still be salvaged by standing against the fanaticism that had destroyed it. For the French dignitaries, this moment was surreal. American and German officers united in defense of their lives. The sight of men in different uniforms, listening intently to the same words of resolve, struck them deeply. Some of them, hardened politicians, could not help but compare it to debates in parliaments, but here the stakes were survival itself. The silence that followed the speeches was heavy, broken only by the distant cries of owls. It was the quiet before the storm, a silence every man knew would soon be shattered by the crack of gunfire. The castle had become a single heartbeat, waiting for the inevitable clash. All through the night, preparations continued with feverish energy. Americans reinforced machine gun positions along the battlements, their barrels pointed toward the tree line. German volunteers dug shallow trenches just outside the gates, creating kill zones that would slow an advance. The French dignitaries, determined not to remain idle, carried water and passed ammunition to those on the walls. Even elderly statesmen like Daladier and Raynor carried crates, grimacing but refusing to appear weak in the face of danger. In the kitchens, servants boiled water for the long hours ahead, aware that battle was measured not only in bullets, but in endurance. The tanks were moved slightly, repositioned so their guns could sweep the valley approaches with deadly arcs of fire. Spotters in the towers scanned the forests endlessly, straining to separate shadows from movement. The sound of spades, boots, and whispered orders echoed within the fortress. Every man knew he might not live to see another sunrise. Yet none wavered, for the moment demanded courage greater than fear. As dawn began to break, the first definite signs of the enemy's presence appeared. Through binoculars, scouts saw the glint of metal, the flicker of helmets, and the faint movement of columns advancing through the misty valleys. There could be no doubt now, the SS were closing in. The defenders tightened their grips on rifles, some whispering prayers, others muttering curses under their breath. Lee strode along the ramparts, his presence a reminder that leadership was forged in moments like this. Gangl's German volunteers stood shoulder to shoulder with American troops, ready to fire on their former comrades. The French prisoners crowded at the windows, straining to see the approaching enemy that meant death or deliverance. Every creak of the castle's timbers, every flutter of birds from the trees heightened the tension. The world beyond the walls seemed to narrow into one singular truth. The SS had come, and there would be no retreat. In that instant, Castle Itter was transformed into the front line of the war's strangest and most improbable battle. The intelligence of the impending attack sparked debates among the commanders inside the castle. Some suggested a breakout, a desperate attempt to slip away before the noose tightened, but Lee dismissed the idea. Retreat would mean abandoning the French dignitaries to certain execution. Gangl agreed, pointing out that the terrain favored defense, not flight. The fortress, he argued, had withstood centuries of conflict, and with tanks and machine guns it could hold even against greater numbers. Ultimately, the decision was unanimous. They would stand and fight. Orders rippled through the defenders. Final adjustments made to firing positions. Final rounds checked in magazines. The French prisoners, overhearing these decisions, felt both dread and relief. They would not be abandoned, even if it meant their rescuers would die beside them. The unity of this choice sealed the defenders' resolve. There was no longer any doubt about what awaited them. The defenders of Castle Itter would fight to the last. For the French dignitaries, the night before battle was unforgettable in its strangeness. Men who once held power over empires now stood behind sandbags, rifles at their sides, as though they were common soldiers. They exchanged nervous jokes, partly to mask their fear, partly to remind themselves they were still alive. Reynaud and Daladier, who had once been bitter political rivals, found themselves sharing the same watch at a window slit. General Weygand offered tactical advice, recalling his days as a commander in earlier wars, though he admitted that modern firepower was beyond his experience. The sense of irony was not lost on anyone. France's leaders, long divided, now faced death united. Soldiers who overheard their conversations whispered that history itself was mocking them, but also giving them a chance at redemption. The castle's ancient halls echoed with footsteps, whispered orders, and the occasional nervous laugh. Every creak in the silence felt louder. Every flicker of torchlight seemed sharper. The castle was no longer just a fortress. It was a crucible where fate would test all within. By morning their courage would be weighed against the fury of fanaticism. As scouts confirmed the tightening noose of the SS, the defenders braced themselves for the strangest battle of the war. The irony was not lost on anyone. Americans, Wehrmacht defectors, French dignitaries and castle staff, all united to resist the fanatical stormtroopers of the collapsing Reich. The defenders were perhaps fewer than 50 men in total, facing more than triple their number. Yet they possessed something the SS lacked: cohesion born of necessity, courage born of desperation, and a unity forged in the face of annihilation. The French dignitaries looked at their protectors with awe, realizing that these men were risking everything for them. Lee and Gangl exchanged one final nod, a silent pact of trust between former enemies. The morning mist began to lift, revealing dark figures advancing through the trees. The battle was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. Within moments the silence would shatter into thunder. Castle Itter stood ready, its defenders braced, its walls primed for history's strangest clash. And so the final act of defiance prepared to unfold against the dying roar of the Third Reich. As the first pale light of dawn spread across the Tyrolean Alps, the silence surrounding Castle Itter was broken by the crackle of rifle fire. From the tree line, Waffen SS soldiers unleashed their opening volleys, their gunfire echoing through the valley like a grim announcement of the battle to come. The defenders, already tense and alert from the night, immediately sprang into action, rushing to their assigned positions. Machine guns mounted on the castle's walls barked out their reply, their tracers slicing through the misty morning air. American soldiers leaned into their weapons, their helmets glinting faintly in the early light, while Wehrmacht defectors positioned themselves alongside them with grim determination. From the courtyard, the heavy sound of the Sherman tank's cannon thundered, its shells tearing into the slopes where enemy fire originated. Bullets clanged against the stone walls, chipping masonry and filling the air with dust. Inside the fortress, the French dignitaries listened in stunned silence, hearing the unmistakable roar of battle crash against their sanctuary. The war had come to their prison in a way they had never expected, an all-or-nothing clash on their very doorstep. The defenders, vastly outnumbered, knew this was no mere skirmish but a fight for survival. The SS had arrived in force, intent on overwhelming them. Yet within those walls, resolve held as firm as the ancient stones themselves. The SS attacked with ferocity, firing from mortars and machine guns hidden in the dense woods below the castle. Their bullets raked across the battlements, forcing defenders to crouch low behind sandbags and parapets. Gangl's German volunteers, familiar with their countrymen's tactics, shouted warnings and pointed out likely positions of advancing enemy squads. Captain Lee issued sharp, precise orders, moving his men like pieces on a chessboard to cover blind spots and reinforce vulnerable points. The defenders fought as one unit, American discipline merging with German pragmatism and French desperation. The Sherman tank, positioned at a key angle, blasted shell after shell into the forest, scattering SS formations before they could consolidate. Still, the attackers pressed closer, their black uniforms blending into the underbrush as they advanced up the slopes. The smell of cordite and gunpowder filled the air, mingling with the smoke rising from burning trees struck by tank fire. Shouts and curses echoed in German as the SS barked commands to encircle the fortress. It was clear they intended to storm the gates, regardless of losses. For the defenders, the first wave was only the beginning. Their endurance would be tested as hour after hour of combat loomed before them. Inside the castle, the French VIPs were no longer idle spectators, but active participants in their own defense. Though most had never held a rifle in years, some carried ammunition boxes to the walls, hands trembling but determined. General Weygand offered advice to the soldiers, recalling tactics from decades past, while Daladier and Raynor worked side by side to steady frightened staff members. Nervous servants ferried water and food to exhausted fighters, transforming from caretakers to essential lifelines in the chaos. At one point, Paul Raynor personally handed cartridges to an American gunner, muttering, "For France and for all of us." The irony of their situation was not lost on anyone. Politicians who once debated policy in Paris were now crouched under fire in a medieval castle. Their lives hung in the balance, tied to the courage of men they had never met until days before. The sounds of gunfire and explosions shook the ancient walls, rattling windows and splintering shutters. Yet within the castle, a strange unity took hold, binding leaders, soldiers, and servants together in shared survival. Every individual, regardless of rank or past status, had a role in the defense. The castle was no longer a prison, but a bastion of resistance. The defenders' weapons blazed tirelessly, their barrels growing hot as wave after wave of SS fighters tested the walls. American Browning machine guns tore into advancing squads, cutting them down before they reached the moat. Gangl himself stood exposed in the courtyard, firing his rifle with the calm precision of a man who had made his peace with death. His German volunteers mirrored his defiance. Each bullet they fired aimed not only at the enemy, but at the betrayal of the Reich itself. On the walls, American soldiers rotated positions, ensuring no weapon fell silent, even as fatigue and fear gnawed at their bodies. The Sherman tank shifted again, firing into the densest clusters of SS troops, sending shockwaves through the valley. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, mingling with the morning mist to obscure vision and heighten the confusion. Despite their ferocity, the SS found themselves pinned down by accurate fire and the castle's natural defences. Yet their numbers were vast, and more were seen approaching from the distant roads. For the defenders, each passing hour brought both pride and dread. Pride in their ability to hold, dread in the knowledge that reinforcements for the enemy might tip the balance. As the sun climbed higher, the tempo of the battle intensified. Mortar shells whistled overhead, slamming into the outer walls and shaking the fortress to its core. Stone fragments flew through the air, striking defenders and causing painful but mostly superficial wounds. Still, the barrage wore on nerves, testing even the bravest among them. Captain Lee walked the ramparts, his voice carrying above the gunfire, urging his men to hold steady. He reminded them that help would come, though none could say when or from where. Gangl, too, offered words of encouragement, particularly to his German volunteers, who knew they fought against former comrades. "Today we fight for Germany's soul," he told them, words that rang with conviction in the chaos. The defenders, though outnumbered, fought with a ferocity born of necessity. The French dignitaries, peering from windows, could hardly believe the battle unfolding below. To them the clash seemed both surreal and inevitable, a grotesque finale to years of war. And yet they found themselves inspired by the courage of those risking everything for their survival. The SS tried repeatedly to storm the gates, but each attempt ended in bloody failure. Machine gun fire and tank shells tore apart their ranks before they could cross the open ground. Some attempted to scale the walls, grappling hooks thrown desperately upward, only to be cut down by rifle fire from above. The moat, shallow but still an obstacle, became a killing zone where attackers fell in heaps under relentless barrages. The defenders exploited every advantage, firing down from elevated positions that gave them clear lines of sight. Yet, with each failed assault, the SS regrouped, shouting curses and rallying for another charge. Their fanatical determination was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a reminder of how far the ideology of the Reich had poisoned its soldiers. Inside the castle, ammunition stocks began to dwindle, raising concerns about how long they could last. Still, rationing and careful bursts of fire managed to keep the weapons alive. The defenders knew that time was their greatest ally. If they held long enough, perhaps rescue would arrive. Until then, every bullet mattered, every shot a small act of defiance against overwhelming odds. By mid-morning, the courtyard had become a frenzy of activity. Men dashed between positions, carrying ammunition belts, water and messages under fire. French dignitaries, abandoning any pretense of detachment, shouted encouragement and even offered to take rifles themselves. Though Captain Lee refused their direct participation, their presence alone added moral weight to the defense. Every explosion that rocked the castle seemed to reinforce the unity of its defenders. In one corner, a wounded American received treatment from a German volunteer, their former enmity forgotten in the urgency of battle. Elsewhere, French servants tended to injuries, tearing strips of cloth to bandage bleeding wounds. The defenders fought not as disparate groups, but as one cohesive force, bound by necessity and fate. Outside the walls, the SS regrouped yet again, preparing for another push. Their determination was relentless, their attacks unyielding. Yet the castle stood, battered but unbroken, a defiant island of resistance against the tide of fanaticism. As the hours dragged on, the defenders realized they were fighting not just for survival, but for a symbol greater than themselves. Castle Itter had become the last stage of a war defined by contradictions and ironies, a medieval fortress where Americans, Germans, and French leaders fought together against the regime that had enslaved Europe. The SS continued their relentless pressure, but with each failed charge, their aura of invincibility cracked. The defenders clung to hope, though exhaustion gnawed at every limb and eardrums rang from the ceaseless gunfire. The tank's gun barrel smoked from overuse, its crew working furiously to keep it in action. Riflemen on the walls fired with mechanical precision, each shot a testament to endurance. Inside, the French dignitaries prayed silently, their thoughts on families far away and on the strange destiny that had led them here. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the battlefield littered with the fallen. Still the SS came, their fanaticism undimmed, their assault unbroken. For the defenders, the only certainty was that this battle would end either in annihilation or in deliverance. And as the echoes of war shook the castle, every man braced for what the next assault would bring. Few moments in the Second World War carried the sheer absurdity and irony of what unfolded inside the walls of Castle Itter. American GIs, dressed in olive drab, crouched beside German Wehrmacht soldiers in faded grey, both pouring fire down upon the advancing black-clad SS. The French VIP prisoners, once accustomed to ministerial desks and presidential offices, now scurried through the courtyard carrying ammunition crates to the firing lines. Politicians who had once debated over budgets and treaties now shouted for rifle magazines and water as bullets pinged off the stone walls around them. Daladier, who had signed the Munich Agreement years earlier, found himself staggering under the weight of a box of cartridges for a Browning machine gun. Paul Reynaud, his bitter rival in French politics, was reduced to crouching near a gunner, handing over belt after belt of ammunition. Soldiers glanced at them in disbelief, muttering that history itself had twisted into parody. Yet in that moment, there were no ranks, no past reputations, only men bound by the primal instinct to survive. The castle echoed with gunfire, explosions, and the frantic shouts of orders in English, German, and French. Outside, the SS pressed closer, undeterred by their losses. Inside, unity had become their only weapon. American Captain Jack Lee fired from the battlements alongside Josef Gangl, a Wehrmacht major who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler, but now fought to destroy his regime. The two officers, symbols of opposite worlds, barked commands that mingled in the smoky air, their men following without hesitation. Lee's GIs marveled at the sight of German soldiers firing shoulder to shoulder with them, the very enemy they had fought across Europe for years. Gangl's Germans, equally astonished, felt relief that at last they were fighting for something righteous, not the lies of the Reich. Between them moved French dignitaries, absurdly out of place, yet now part of the fabric of the battle. General Weygand, stooped with age, gave tactical suggestions to machine gun crews, pointing out firing arcs as though briefing young officers decades earlier. Politicians fetched water for wounded soldiers, their hands trembling from strain, yet determined not to be idle. The surreal image of this motley force was heightened by the grandeur of their surroundings, the medieval castle that groaned under modern gunfire. Rifles cracked from arrow slits, machine guns thundered from battlements, and mortars crashed against ancient stone. It was a tableau of contradictions: medieval fortress, modern war, enemies turned allies, leaders turned foot soldiers. History, it seemed, had reached its strangest stage. The French prisoners, though untrained in combat, displayed surprising determination under fire. Jean Barotra, the famous tennis champion, sprinted across the courtyard with a bundle of ammunition belts slung around his neck, dodging shards of stone kicked up by incoming fire. His athleticism earned cheers from defenders, who joked he was still the fastest man alive, even under fire. Maxime Weygand, though frail, refused to hide, instead pacing nervously to encourage others with firm words. Daladier and Reynaud, long political adversaries, worked side by side carrying crates, their former arguments erased by the immediacy of survival. Even the castle's cooks and staff rushed to support the defenders, hauling buckets of water to cool overheated machine guns. The surreal sight of French servants tossing belts of cartridges up to American gunners was seared into memory for the defenders. Such unity carried morale far beyond what numbers could suggest. The VIPs had become comrades in arms, men whose titles and histories dissolved in the smoke of battle. Outside, the SS howled as they launched another charge, determined to breach the walls. Inside, the castle rang with shouts of encouragement, the clash of boots on stone, and the bark of rifles. It was a strange and chaotic harmony forged in fire. The Sherman tank, parked within the courtyard, roared to life whenever enemy concentrations grew too bold. Its cannon thundered across the valley, scattering SS squads and reducing their cover to splintered trees and shattered rocks. French dignitaries flinched with each deafening blast, their ears ringing, yet they continued ferrying shells to the tank crew with grim determination. The absurdity of former prime ministers hauling tank rounds was not lost on anyone, least of all the crew themselves, who exchanged bemused grins even as they worked furiously. Soldiers shouted instructions across languages, gestures filling the gaps where words failed. Americans yelled for ammo, in English Germans translated, and French prisoners delivered, creating a bizarre yet effective chain of supply. In one corner, an elderly prisoner muttered prayers while feeding cartridges into a machine gun belt. In another, a German defector covered an American rifleman, both crouched behind the same wall. The castle shook under the combined fury of modern weaponry, its stones cracking but refusing to yield. The defenders' strange alliance seemed almost unreal, as though they were players in a theatre of war written by irony itself. And yet each man fought with deadly seriousness, for death pressed close at the gates. The air grew thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of burning gunpowder, making every breath a labor. Within the haze, defenders fought side by side in ways that defied the logic of the war outside. An American medic treated a wounded German volunteer, pressing bandages against a bleeding shoulder as bullets ricocheted nearby. French prisoners helped carry the injured into makeshift shelters, ignoring their own fatigue to keep others alive. A moment of dark humor arose when one of the politicians attempted to fire a rifle, fumbling awkwardly before handing it back with a sheepish grin. Even in the midst of chaos, laughter briefly broke through, reminding all that humanity endured even here. Then the laughter was drowned again by the crash of mortars and the rattle of machine guns. The surrealism of the battle deepened as SS corpses piled at the base of the walls while dignitaries ran supplies overhead. At times the castle seemed to exist outside of time, a medieval citadel locked in a war that belonged to another century. Yet the reality of death and survival was never far away. The defenders clung desperately to their fragile unity, for it was the only thing stronger than the enemy outside. The French dignitaries found themselves tested in ways none had ever imagined during their political careers. Used to speeches and debates, they now shouted encouragement to soldiers between bursts of rifle fire. Their voices, trembling yet determined, carried through the halls like strange echoes of a parliament turned battlefield. Paul Renaud crouched beside a machine gunner, feeding belts of ammunition, with a rhythm that became almost instinctive. Daladier dragged water buckets to cool the gun's overheated barrel, his shirt soaked with sweat. General Weygand, though unfit to fight, barked tactical suggestions, his old instincts sharpening as he watched enemy movements. Jane Borotra, restless as always, volunteered to scale the walls and carry messages between posts, his agility astounding the soldiers. In the chaos, roles blurred, politicians became porters, generals became advisors, athletes became messengers. Every individual, regardless of background, carried weight in the defense. The castle's walls reverberated with the fusion of voices, gunfire, and command shouted in 3 different languages. This cacophony was not confusion, but unity born of necessity. It was a battle scene, unlike any other in the long, brutal history of the war. Outside, the Waffen SS pressed their attacks with relentless determination, hurling themselves against the castle in waves. Yet inside, the defenders' bizarre alliance only grew stronger under fire. Soldiers glanced at their unusual comrades with newfound respect, marveling that men who once governed nations now carried bullets like privates. For the French prisoners, their humiliation of captivity transformed into a strange form of redemption. They were fighting, if only indirectly, in their nation's defense. The American GIs, initially skeptical, came to rely on their efforts, accepting cartridges and water from hands that once signed treaties. The German defectors, for their part, found pride in protecting the French leaders they had once despised, eager to cleanse their honor. The battle blurred every distinction between nationality, rank, and past allegiance. Smoke obscured the valley, muffling the chaos into a constant roar of violence. The ancient stones of the fortress bore witness to the absurdity, scarred by bullets and scorched by fire. Yet still the walls held, and with them the defenders' resolve. In its strangeness, the battle became an extraordinary testament to the will to resist. As midday approached, the castle walls echoed with a symphony of contradictions, rifle fire, cannon blasts, shouted orders, and the unlikely voices of politicians laboring as porters. What unfolded was more than a clash of arms. It was a surreal tableau of history colliding with irony. In one moment, an American GI laughed in disbelief as a French former prime minister handed him a fresh clip of ammunition. In another, a German volunteer and an American soldier covered each other's blind spots, their rifles spitting fire in synchronized bursts. The French dignitaries, who once commanded armies with words, now contributed to battle with sweat and strain. Even within the nightmare, there was dignity in their determination to help, however small their actions. The SS hurled themselves at the fortress again and again, but each charge was broken against the walls and the combined fire of its defenders. By now exhaustion painted every face, but unity kept them standing. The absurdity of the battle had become its strength, binding enemies and rivals into comrades. Within the smoke-filled halls of Castle Itter, history was being rewritten with each bullet fired. The strangest battle of World War II raged on, defying all logic yet affirming the raw resilience of humanity. By the afternoon of May 5, 1945, Castle Itter's defenders were reaching the breaking point. Hours of relentless combat had drained their strength, and now the reality of dwindling ammunition pressed on every mind. The Browning machine guns, once roaring with confidence, now fired in short, measured bursts to conserve precious rounds. Riflemen counted each cartridge with care, knowing every shot had to find its mark. The Sherman tank, their most formidable weapon, had nearly exhausted its shell supply, each thunderous blast now debated before being fired. French dignitaries, who had labored tirelessly to supply ammunition, found themselves moving lighter crates, the reserves within the castle nearly gone. Captain Jack Lee's face was set in grim determination as he walked the battlements, urging discipline even as he calculated the dire odds. Josef Gangl reminded his German volunteers to hold fire until the enemy was nearly on top of them, maximizing their dwindling bullets. The air reeked of smoke and sweat. The castle's courtyard littered with shattered wood, shell casings, and wounded men. Outside, the Waffen SS pressed closer, emboldened by the thinning fire from the walls. It was clear that the defenders were running out of strength. The hours ahead would decide their fate. The Waffen SS sensed weakness and attacked with renewed fury, determined to breach the walls before nightfall. Mortar rounds slammed into the outer towers, cracking stone and sending showers of debris down on defenders. Machine gun nests on the battlements rattled under concentrated fire, forcing gunners to duck and conserve ammunition. American and German riflemen traded grim looks, their magazines nearly empty, their trigger fingers hesitant. In the courtyard, French dignitaries ferried the last boxes of bullets, like sacred treasures, their faces pale with exhaustion. Some defenders were reduced to single cartridges in their pockets, waiting for the inevitable charge. Every man understood the grim mathematics of battle. Numbers favored the SS, and time was no longer on their side. Gangl whispered to his comrades that this might be their last stand. His words met with stoic nods. Captain Lee ordered fallback positions inside the castle halls, preparing for room-to-room combat should the gates fall. The defenders, though weary, were not yet broken. The SS howled from the slopes, surging forward with fanatical cries. The moment of decision was near. Inside the castle, the atmosphere grew darker with every passing minute. The French dignitaries, once buoyed by the surreal unity of the defense, now felt the creeping chill of impending annihilation. Paul Reynaud whispered that they were witnessing their last hours, though Daladier insisted stubbornly that survival was still possible. Jean Barotra, restless and determined, begged to break out and run for reinforcements, but Captain Lee refused. Abandoning the castle would mean certain slaughter of those left behind. The tension was unbearable, each man caught between hope and despair. Soldiers rotated their positions, not for rest but to share the final scraps of ammunition. Wounded men groaned in corners, their bandages soaked through, while servants tried to ease their pain with what little supplies remained. The ancient halls, once symbols of Tyrolean pride, echoed with the sounds of desperation. Outside, the pounding of mortar fire shook the stone, raining dust into the dimly lit chambers. Every crash of artillery reminded them that the enemy was tightening the noose. Time seemed to slow, every second stretching into eternity. Within those walls, the defenders were locked in a crucible of courage and dread. The SS attempted to storm the main gate, their boots thudding against the wooden doors as explosives rattled the iron hinges. The defenders answered with what little firepower they had left, grenades and rifles cutting down the first wave. Yet the pressure did not relent. Wave after wave crashed against the entrance, testing the strength of wood and stone. In the courtyard, the Sherman tank blasted one of its last shells, shattering a group of attackers massed at the gate. The explosion bought precious minutes, but the smoke revealed the stark truth. Their arsenal was nearly empty. Men looked at one another with hollow eyes, silently asking how much longer they could hold. Gangl stood tall, rallying his Germans, telling them they would not surrender, even if their bullets ran dry. Lee reinforced this resolve, reminding his men that retreat was not an option, not when the lives of the French leaders were at stake. The defenders clung to one another with unspoken understanding. Each shot from the battlements became more deliberate, aimed at nothing less than survival. Outside, the SS regrouped for another charge. The walls of Castle Itter groaned under the weight of history. The defenders began to contemplate the unimaginable hand-to-hand combat within the castle walls. Knives, bayonets, and even makeshift clubs were readied as ammunition dwindled to the last rounds. French dignitaries, realizing the severity, swore to fight with whatever they could grasp, chairs, bottles, or bare fists if necessary. General Weygand, his voice steady despite trembling hands, told them that even leaders must bleed if the fortress fell. It was a moment of terrible dignity, men of politics preparing to die as soldiers. The Americans and Germans distributed their final cartridges, each bullet treated like a lifeline. The Sherman crew debated whether to use its very last shell or save it for the final breach. Above them, Snipers picked carefully at exposed SS troops, every trigger pull deliberate, every shot intended to buy seconds. The defenders braced for the gates to give way, their weapons aimed at the shadows gathering below. It was no longer about winning, only about holding until the end. Within those walls, the silence between volleys was louder than the gunfire itself. The defenders stood ready to meet death face to face. As the battle dragged into the desperate hours, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm the defenders as much as enemy fire. Men's hands shook not only from fear, but from sheer fatigue, their muscles cramping after endless hours on the walls. Sweat mixed with blood and grime, streaking faces that no longer resembled those of soldiers but of survivors. Yet still they fought, each second an act of defiance against the Reich's death throes. The SS hurled grenades that rattled across the courtyard, sending defenders scrambling to kick them away or smother blasts with sandbags. Each detonation left new scars in the stone, yet the walls endured as stubbornly as their defenders. Inside the castle halls, prayers and curses mingled, whispered by men who had nothing left but faith and rage. The French dignitaries, too, whispered to one another, some confessing regrets, others summoning courage. Redinord swore he would not be taken alive, clutching a pistol handed to him by an American soldier. Daladier shook his head, insisting survival was still possible, his optimism sounding hollow in the smoke-choked air. The castle had become a furnace of human will, where fear and defiance burned side by side, and as the SS prepared their next assault, the defenders waited for the storm to break. Captain Lee and Major Gangl stood together on the battlements, surveying the chaos with grim clarity. Lee clenched his jaw, his mind racing with calculations, each one darker than the last. Gangl, more stoic, spoke of honor, telling Lee that if this was to be their end, it was better to fall here than to live as servants of tyranny. Their words carried to the men nearby, instilling courage even as death loomed. The defenders found strength in the sight of their leaders refusing to waver. Even the French prisoners huddled below drew inspiration from this unlikely brotherhood of Americans and Germans. It was a surreal moment of unity, forged not in treaties but in blood and fire. Outside, the SS regrouped yet again, their commanders shouting for another all-out assault. The attackers' shadows lengthened as the sun sank lower, promising one final clash before nightfall. Inside the castle, silence fell as men checked their last cartridges and gripped their bayonets. Every man knew the next wave might break through. In that stillness, courage hardened into resolve. The final hours of daylight became a nightmare of survival. Each minute stretching into an eternity. Ammunition had nearly run dry, forcing defenders to ration single bullets as though they were diamonds. Machine guns sputtered to silence, their barrels cool, not by choice but by necessity. The SS surged again, their fanatical cries rising with terrifying intensity as they sensed victory near. Inside, defenders prepared for the possibility of the walls being breached, their bodies tense, their weapons ready for close quarters fighting. French dignitaries armed themselves with pistols, knives, and even wooden clubs, their dignity stripped to its raw essence. General Weygand murmured that history would remember this moment, whether they lived or died. The defenders braced themselves for the gate to shatter, for SS boots to flood the courtyard, for blood to soak the stones. Yet even at the edge of collapse, not one voice called for surrender. It was a stand beyond politics, beyond nationality, beyond the war itself. Castle Itter had become a symbol of humanity's stubborn refusal to bow to tyranny, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the desperate hours carved their place in history. As the afternoon waned into evening, Castle Itter's defenders teetered on the brink of annihilation. The Waffen SS pressed harder than ever, sensing that exhaustion and dwindling ammunition would soon break their enemies. Within the walls, Captain Jack Lee and Josef Gangl, braced for what they believed might be the final assault. Then, faint at first, came a sound that electrified the defenders, the distant rumble of engines and the grinding of treads on the mountain road. At first some thought it was a cruel trick of imagination, born from desperation and fatigue. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, punctuated by the clatter of armored vehicles. The defenders rushed to the walls, straining their eyes toward the forested slopes. And there, emerging from the trees, came the unmistakable silhouette of American tanks. The stars painted on their armor gleamed faintly in the light, symbols of salvation to those trapped within the fortress. Soldiers shouted, some weeping openly, as relief seemed finally at hand. For the first time all day, hope surged through Castle Itter. Reinforcements were coming. Outside the castle, the Waffen SS quickly realized the tide was about to turn. Their commanders barked frantic orders, attempting to press one more furious assault before the Americans arrived in force. But the defenders, revitalized by the sight of reinforcements, met their charge with renewed vigor. Every remaining cartridge, every last grenade, was hurled with precision and desperation. Bullets cracked from the battlements with surprising strength, as though courage itself had refilled their magazines. The SS faltered under the sudden ferocity, their momentum broken by defenders who only minutes before had been near collapse. Then the first shells from American Shermans roared through the valley, tearing into SS positions with devastating effect. Trees splintered, machine gun nests vanished in eruptions of earth and fire. German troops scattered in confusion, their morale crumbling as Allied steel advanced. The defenders of Castle Itter cheered, their voices hoarse yet triumphant. Salvation was no longer a dream but a reality thundering up the road. The relief column was small but decisive, composed of tanks and infantry drawn from nearby American units. These soldiers had heard the bizarre tale of French dignitaries trapped in a medieval castle and rushed with urgency to their aid. When they crested the final rise and saw the battered fortress surrounded by SS, the sight was unforgettable. Castle Itter's walls were pocked with shrapnel scars, its towers belching smoke, yet still it stood defiant. American tank commanders wasted no time maneuvering their vehicles into firing positions. The thunder of their cannons ripped into the enemy ranks, scattering groups of black-uniformed SS into the woods. Infantry leapt from their half-tracks, advancing with rifles blazing and grenades in hand. The Waffen SS, caught between the fortress defenders and the advancing Americans, collapsed into disarray. Some fought stubbornly, others broke and ran, but the battle's outcome was now inevitable. Within minutes, the strangest siege of the war was unraveling in favor of its unlikely defenders. The castle that had been on the brink of falling now became the site of a rout. Inside the castle walls, the defenders exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Exhausted men slumped against the stones, too drained to cheer loudly, though their hearts thundered with joy. French dignitaries clasped hands, embracing each other in disbelief that rescue had come in time. Paul Reynaud whispered that they had been delivered from death at the very gates of hell. Soldiers who had rationed bullets now watched as the Americans poured firepower into the enemy with seemingly endless reserves. Captain Lee barked orders to coordinate with the incoming forces, ensuring they didn't mistakenly fire on friendly positions. Gangl, though weary, stood tall, his face breaking into the faintest smile at the sight of his countrymen scattered before Allied might. It was vindication for his choice to defy the Nazi regime and stand for honor. Above them, the smoke of burning SS positions drifted into the evening sky. For the defenders, the nightmare was lifting, replaced by the surreal calm that follows salvation. Hope had returned to Castle Itter, carried on the tracks of American tanks. The SS made one final attempt to regroup, launching scattered attacks in desperation. But their efforts were swiftly crushed by the combined fire of American reinforcements and castle defenders. Mortar teams were silenced by direct tank fire, their weapons reduced to twisted wreckage. Machine gunners who had tormented the fortress walls were mowed down in seconds by advancing infantry. Within an hour, the hillside that had swarmed with SS soldiers was eerily quiet. Survivors fled into the woods, abandoning weapons and wounded in their panic. The defenders peered over the battlements, watching black uniformed figures scatter like shadows before the dawn. For the first time since the battle began, the castle's walls no longer shook under constant assault. Smoke curled lazily from the ruins of enemy positions, a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Captain Lee signaled the all clear, and cheers echoed through the fortress. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. What had begun as a desperate stand now ended in unexpected victory. The Americans quickly secured the area, herding captured SS soldiers into makeshift pens. Prisoners were disarmed and marched down the road, their faces pale with shock at the defeat. Castle defenders emerged cautiously from their positions, greeting their rescuers with weary smiles and heartfelt gratitude. French dignitaries stepped forward, introducing themselves formally to bewildered American officers. For the soldiers of the 12th Armored Division, it was a surreal moment. Here were France's political leaders and generals, rescued from a medieval fortress in the final days of the war. General Wigan bowed slightly, thanking the young Americans who had risked their lives for his freedom. Paul Renault, his voice thick with emotion, declared that liberty had been restored within those ancient walls. Captain Lee, once stern and commanding, now allowed himself a rare smile as he shook hands with his fellow countrymen. Josef Gangl, silent but proud, stood with his German volunteers, knowing they had redeemed their honor. In that moment, enemies had truly become allies. The battle had forged a bond stronger than politics. For the defenders, relief was mixed with exhaustion and grief. The cost of the battle weighed heavily, as men tended to their wounded and counted the fallen. Josef Gangl, who had risked everything to oppose the SS, had given his life in the defense of the castle, struck down by a sniper's bullet. His comrades mourned quietly, understanding that his sacrifice symbolized the noblest form of resistance. The Americans honored him as a hero, acknowledging his courage and his choice to fight tyranny even at the end. French dignitaries paid tribute, bowing their heads in silence for the German officer who had saved them. His death underscored the surreal unity of the battle, Americans, Germans, and French standing together against a common foe. Survivors wrapped his body with care, vowing to remember him not as an enemy, but as a man of honor. Around them the castle walls bore silent witness, their stones scarred yet unbroken. The air was filled with both relief and sorrow, the bittersweet price of victory. For those who lived, the strange battle would never be forgotten. As night descended on May 5th, 1945, Castle Itter stood quiet at last. The fires of battle smouldered in the valley below, but within the fortress, peace returned for the first time in days. Soldiers shared food and water, offering their rations to the French dignitaries who had endured so much. Laughter, tentative and weary, echoed through the halls, mingling with sighs of relief. The Americans secured the perimeter, confident no further attack would come. The French leaders, once prisoners, now savored the sweet taste of freedom in the strangest of settings. Captain Lee recorded the victory, though he knew history would scarcely believe it. Men slept where they sat, rifles in hand, too exhausted to move, but too relieved to care. Castle Itter had become a symbol of unity in chaos, a fortress where enemies fought side by side against the shadows of tyranny. The battle was over, but its legend had just begun. In the heart of the Alps, World War II had written one of its strangest chapters, and for the survivors, it was a night they would carry in memory forever. Amid the chaos of Castle Itter's defense, Josef Gangl's fate was sealed in a single selfless act. As Waffen SS snipers rained fire upon the fortress walls, Gangl spotted a French dignitary exposed in the courtyard. Without hesitation, he dashed forward, placing his own body between the prisoner and the incoming shot. The crack of a rifle echoed through the castle, and the German officer collapsed, mortally wounded. Those around him rushed to his side, but the damage was irreversible. In that instant, the battle's strangeness crystallized into tragedy. A German Wehrmacht major dying to protect a former enemy. His comrades and the Americans who fought beside him bore witness to his sacrifice, stunned by its nobility. Even the French prisoners, divided by politics and rivalries, united in sorrow for the man who had saved one of their own. Gangl's fall symbolized a reversal of the Nazi world order, where loyalty to conscience outweighed loyalty to the Führer. In the dying embers of the Reich, he embodied a rare form of honor. His death was both a loss and a legacy. Gangl had not been a fanatic, nor a zealot of Hitler's ideology. Unlike many in the Wehrmacht who clung to blind obedience, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with the crimes committed in the Reich's name. Witnessing atrocities in occupied territories, he had turned inward, wrestling with the contradictions of duty and morality. By 1945, as the regime crumbled, his allegiance shifted decisively to the people of Tyrol, whom he sought to shield from pointless destruction. This inner transformation culminated in his decision to join forces with the Americans and defend Castle Itter. It was a step that placed him in direct opposition to the SS, the very power apparatus he had once served under. Few men of rank dared such defiance, yet Gangl did so without hesitation, guided by his conscience rather than orders. His comrades, German soldiers weary of war, followed his lead into this improbable alliance. At Castle Itter, he became both a commander and a symbol, the bridge between enemies who had chosen humanity over ideology. His sacrifice confirmed the depth of that transformation. In death, he transcended his uniform. The moment of his fall reverberated through the defenders like a shockwave. Captain Jack Lee, the American commander, felt the weight of responsibility double upon his shoulders. French dignitaries, stunned by the selflessness of their unlikely protector, gathered solemnly as the wounded man was carried aside. The battle raged on, yet whispers of his sacrifice spread among the defenders, strengthening their resolve. Men fired with renewed determination, knowing they fought not only for survival, but in honor of their fallen comrade. For the Wehrmacht soldiers who had chosen to side with the Americans, Gangl's death was deeply personal. They saw in him the embodiment of their own difficult choices, the proof that resistance against tyranny was possible, even for those born into the machinery of war. His body, lifeless but dignified, became a rallying point amid the chaos. The paradox of the battle, that Germans defended Frenchmen with Americans, was made all the more poignant by his sacrifice. He had crossed the invisible line between enemy and ally with his life as the price. It was the ultimate act of redemption. After the battle, as silence settled over Castle Itter, Gangl's sacrifice took on profound significance. His comrades and the Americans wrapped his body with care, treating him not as a foe but as a brother in arms. The French dignitaries stood in silence, bowing their heads in respect for the man who had given his life for one of their own. In that solemn moment, political divisions and national animosities melted away. He was no longer simply a German officer. He was remembered as a protector, a man of conscience. Captain Lee, in later accounts, would describe him with reverence, acknowledging the courage it took to defy his own side in those final days. Even hardened veterans of the US Army recognized the rarity of such a choice. For them, his sacrifice was proof that honor could exist even within the ranks of their sworn enemy. It offered a glimmer of humanity amid the brutal destruction of war. In the ruins of the Third Reich, Josef Gangl became a figure of light. His death transformed tragedy into testimony. The news of Gangl's sacrifice spread quickly among the local Austrian population. For civilians of Tyrol, weary of war and terrified of SS reprisals, his defiance became a story of hope. He had been known to them already as a protector, working to shield townsfolk from senseless destruction in those chaotic final weeks. But his ultimate act at Castle Itter elevated him to near-mythic status. To them, he was no longer simply a major of the Wehrmacht, but a man who had chosen humanity over fanaticism. Families whispered his name with reverence, even as the ashes of war still smoldered around their villages. In liberated Austria, tales of his bravery spread by word of mouth, mingling grief with pride. The memory of his selfless act became part of the region's folklore, recounted as an example of moral courage. For many Austrians, Gangl symbolized the possibility of redemption in a nation stained by its role in the Reich. His name became a quiet beacon in the aftermath of destruction. He was remembered as one who had stood against tyranny when it mattered most. In the years after the war, Josef Gangl's legacy was formally enshrined in Austria. Streets were named after him, and memorials were erected in his honor. In the town of Würg, where he had defended civilians from SS excesses, his memory was cherished as that of a protector. Schools taught of his courage, ensuring new generations understood the cost of his sacrifice. Unlike many Wehrmacht officers whose names faded into obscurity or infamy, Gangl's reputation grew brighter with time. He was recognized not as a participant in Nazi aggression, but as a man who chose defiance in the face of evil. Veterans from both sides recalled his actions at Castle Itter with admiration. French survivors spoke of him with deep gratitude, remembering the moment he fell saving one of their own. Americans who had fought beside him included his name in their retellings of the battle. His story crossed borders, transcending the divisions of war. In death he had united enemies. In memory he became a hero for all. Historians later reflected on the paradox of Josef Gangl's role in World War II. He had been an officer of the Wehrmacht, part of Hitler's war machine, yet he ended his life fighting shoulder to shoulder with Americans against the SS. His story defied the simplistic categories of friend and foe. It revealed the complexity of conscience, the ability of individuals to rise above orders and ideology. Castle Itter itself became the stage for this paradox, with Gangl at the very center of its legend. Scholars pointed out that his act represented one of the rare instances where moral duty overcame institutional obedience. For Austrians, he became a symbol of national redemption, proof that not all had surrendered their humanity under Nazi rule. For the French, he was remembered as a man who had preserved lives that mattered to their nation. For the Americans, he was the enemy who became an ally in the strangest of battles. His life, and especially his death, offered a lesson on courage in its purest form. Josef Gangl stood as proof that humanity could shine through even in history's darkest hours. Today, Josef Gangl's name endures as part of the legacy of Castle Itter, a battle remembered not only for its strangeness, but for its humanity. His sacrifice is honored annually in ceremonies in Tyrol, where locals and officials gather to pay tribute. The castle, now a site of memory, carries his story within its walls. Tourists and historians alike recall that among the Americans, French dignitaries and German soldiers, one man gave his life selflessly for another. His grave has become a place of quiet pilgrimage, where flowers mark the memory of his courage. In the broader narrative of World War II, his story offers a counterpoint to the horrors of fanaticism and destruction. It is a reminder that even within the ranks of the enemy, there were those who chose honor over blind obedience. His act continues to inspire, carrying relevance long after the guns of war have fallen silent. In schools, books, and documentaries, his name is spoken with respect. Josef Gangl remains the fallen hero of Castle Itter. His death ensured that the story of the strangest battle of World War II was also a story of humanity's enduring light. When the smoke finally cleared from Castle Itter on the evening of May 5, 1945, the once looming threat had dissipated into silence. The Waffen SS attackers had been scattered by the arrival of US reinforcements, leaving the battered defenders in a surreal calm after hours of desperate combat. Inside the castle walls, men who had been bitter enemies only days before now stood shoulder to shoulder, united in exhaustion and disbelief. The French VIP prisoners, who had spent years under the weight of Nazi captivity, breathed the first true sighs of relief since their imprisonment began. They had expected death or deportation to extermination, yet liberation had come in the most extraordinary of forms. They were not only freed, but saved by a coalition of Americans, defecting German soldiers, and even the sacrifice of Josef Gangl. For the prisoners, liberation carried a double weight: survival against all odds, and the symbolic collapse of the regime that had tormented them. The men who had once led France, politicians, generals, cultural figures, found themselves rescued in the strangest of battles. Some wept openly, their pride momentarily giving way to raw emotion. Others paced the courtyard silently, as if still unable to believe freedom was real. In that strange twilight, Castle Itter had become more than stone and battlements. It was now the scene of an ending and a beginning. The French VIPs, freed from the grip of terror, reacted in strikingly different ways. Former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, still sharp of mind despite years of captivity, expressed gratitude mixed with astonishment that his survival depended on German soldiers who had defied Hitler. Edouard Daladier, another prime minister who had endured humiliation and imprisonment, appeared more cautious, his expression betraying years of bitterness. General Maxime Weygand, elderly but dignified, stood tall in the courtyard, murmuring words of thanks to the Americans who had delivered salvation. Even the more politically divided figures among them found themselves united in gratitude for the men who had risked everything. Some prisoners instinctively turned their thoughts toward home, longing to return to France and resume lives shattered by war. Others, however, knew their survival would bring political implications, shaping the post-war order of France. Yet in those first hours, politics gave way to sheer relief. Prisoners embraced their rescuers, exchanged words of thanks, and looked at their unlikely saviors with profound respect. For them, this liberation was not just a release from captivity, but a reminder of resilience. Their voices, trembling yet strong, would soon echo in testimonies of the battle, and in those words, Castle Itter's legend began to take form. Testimonies from the French VIPs soon became critical in preserving the memory of what had transpired. They described with vivid detail the shock of fighting alongside American GIs, Wehrmacht soldiers, and their fellow prisoners against the SS. Former French leaders spoke of carrying ammunition, shouting encouragement, and even handling weapons during the siege. Some admitted, with humility, that their survival had depended on ordinary soldiers who had shown extraordinary bravery. Their accounts painted Castle Itter not as a simple battle, but as a surreal moment of convergence in history. Each testimony carried not only the facts of survival, but the emotional depth of gratitude and disbelief. They recounted the tension of waiting for the SS assault, the terror of bullets striking the stone walls, and the chaos of combat that blurred the line between prisoner and defender. In their words, Josef Gangl's sacrifice stood out as a defining moment, immortalized by the men who witnessed his fall. These testimonies, carried to post-war audiences, ensured that the world would know the bizarre but inspiring tale. Through them, Castle Itter entered not only military history, but the cultural memory of a continent scarred by war. The French dignitaries' voices gave human shape to the surreal struggle, and in doing so, they preserved the battle's legacy for generations. Yet even amid liberation, the castle bore the unmistakable scars of violence. The walls of Itter were pockmarked with bullet holes, the courtyard littered with spent casings and fragments of mortar fire. The once stately rooms where dignitaries had been confined now stood in partial ruin, windows shattered and doors splintered. Bloodstains on the stones testified to the price of survival, a reminder that liberation had come through fire and death. Josef Gangl's body, laid with care in a corner of the courtyard, remained a solemn symbol of sacrifice. The French VIPs paused often as they passed the site, offering nods of respect or brief murmured prayers. The Americans, for all their relief, recognized that the cost of the battle lingered in the silence that followed. For the castle itself, centuries of history had culminated in this single strange day of defiance. It would never again be seen merely as a fortress in the Tyrolean Alps. Now it was etched with meaning, a monument of resistance born from desperation. Its walls, scarred by combat, became silent witnesses to an event unlike any other in the war. The stones carried the weight of memory, and those memories would endure long after the soldiers had departed. For the Americans, the liberation of Castle Itter was a mission unlike any other. Soldiers who had fought across Europe found themselves in awe of what had transpired. They had entered the battle expecting to rescue prisoners, but instead they had shared the field with men wearing Wehrmacht uniforms, men who had once been their mortal enemies. The strangeness of the alliance was not lost on them, and many later recalled it as one of the most remarkable episodes of their service. They spoke with admiration of Josef Gangl and his men, acknowledging their courage in defying Hitler and fighting the SS. For these Americans, Castle Itter became more than a victory. It was a story of human complexity. It reminded them that not all Germans had followed Hitler blindly, and that even in war, conscience could forge bridges across divides. As they departed the castle with the French VIPs in tow, they carried not only survivors, but also the memory of an extraordinary brotherhood. Their letters home described the surreal nature of the fight, sometimes with disbelief, sometimes with reverence. In their testimonies, the uniqueness of Castle Itter was sealed. For them, this was not just another battle, it was the strangest and most human of their war. The German soldiers who had sided with Gangl also faced a new reality after liberation. Having openly defied the SS and fought alongside the Americans, they stood apart from the collapsing Reich around them. Some feared retribution, wondering how they would be judged in the days to come. Yet within Tyrol, their actions carried weight, and locals who had seen their defiance began to whisper of them with respect. These Wehrmacht men had chosen humanity at the most dangerous of moments, risking death not only from the SS, but also from their own chain of command. Their role in defending Castle Itter became part of the legend, remembered as proof that even in the final days of the war, conscience could triumph over fear. They walked away from the battle, not as victors, but as redeemed soldiers, their names tied forever to the extraordinary alliance. For some, it was the only redemption they would ever know. For others, it became a legacy that outlived their military careers. In the aftermath, they stood at the edge of history, no longer merely German soldiers, but participants in one of its strangest miracles. Their presence at Castle Itter defined their place in memory. Their courage ensured they were not forgotten. As the French VIPs prepared to depart the castle under American escort, emotions ran high. Some clutched belongings they had carried through years of captivity. Others walked with empty hands, their freedom enough to sustain them. They left behind the grim prison that had confined them, yet they carried its memory etched in their souls. At the castle gates, they paused to bid farewell to those who had defended them, exchanging final words of thanks and solemn handshakes. Their testimonies in the years to come would always carry those gestures, small but profound in meaning. For the French liberation at Castle Itter was more than the regaining of freedom. It was the affirmation of survival against odds engineered for their destruction. The Americans watched as they departed, aware that these men were not only prisoners, but leaders who would return to shape post-war Europe. The weight of history rested heavily in those final moments. Castle Itter stood behind them, scarred yet proud, its silence now filled with meaning. The defenders too looked back, knowing they had witnessed something the world would scarcely believe. The castle was both battlefield and memorial. Its walls carried the echoes of the day. In the days following the battle, Castle Itter was left behind as armies advanced and the war drew to its final conclusion. Yet the fortress, perched high in the Tyrolean Alps, remained a powerful symbol of resistance, unity, and sacrifice. The French VIPs carried its story back to their homeland, where it became part of the broader narrative of liberation. The Americans wrote reports and letters, immortalizing the surreal alliance they had witnessed. Locals preserved the tale in whispered stories, passing it down as part of Austria's wartime folklore. Historians would later reconstruct the events through testimonies, piecing together the strangeness of this battle that defied all logic. The castle itself bore the scars for decades, silent but eloquent in its testimony. Itter became a place of memory, a reminder that in the chaos of destruction, moments of unity could still shine. The liberation of the French prisoners was not just a military episode, it was a moral story, a human story. The aftermath left behind lessons of courage, sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption. And in the shadow of the Alps, Castle Itter remained, its legacy etched in stone and memory alike. Castle Itter's battle stands apart in the vast chronicle of the Second World War because it shattered every expectation of allegiance and enmity. On one side of the castle walls stood American GIs, hardened by months of combat across Europe, carrying the banner of liberation. Beside them, in the same trenches and corridors, were Wehrmacht soldiers who had turned against their former comrades in the SS. Behind them, lending moral strength and even practical help, were French dignitaries, once enemies of Germany, passing ammunition and offering hands where they could. Facing them all were Waffen SS troops, the most fanatical defenders of Hitler's collapsing Reich, determined to kill prisoners rather than see them freed. The symbolism was powerful: soldiers of democracy, defectors from dictatorship, and survivors of persecution united against tyranny's last gasp. No other battle in the war carried this strange alignment of forces, and it stunned even those who lived through it. For the French, it was a liberation that carried irony and hope. For the Americans, it was proof that humanity could rise even in their foes. For the Germans who joined, it was redemption written in blood. The battle became a parable of unity. It was a moment where humanity briefly transcended the divisions of war. The French VIP prisoners themselves added a surreal dimension to the fight, for they were not passive bystanders, but participants in their own liberation. Generals, prime ministers, and intellectuals, accustomed to commanding armies or debating policy, now found themselves thrust into the chaos of combat. In the courtyard, they carried ammunition from room to room, encouraged the defenders, and sometimes even handled weapons. These men, who had once shaped the fate of France, became ordinary fighters in an extraordinary battle. Their political rivalries, sharp and bitter in years past, momentarily dissolved in the face of survival. Paul Reynaud, once bitterly opposed to Édouard Daladier, stood beside him without hesitation, their quarrels irrelevant under fire. Together they bore witness to Josef Gangl's sacrifice and the courage of Captain Lee's Americans. Their role gave the battle a unique symbolism. Leaders who had once been captives now stood as free men because of their own small acts of defiance. In them, the French saw a mirror of their nation's resilience. Their survival was not simply a military event, it was a political and moral statement. Castle Itter became the unlikely stage for France's redemption. In their testimonies, they ensured the world understood that truth. For the Americans, Castle Itter reinforced their role, not only as liberators, but as participants in a greater human drama. Used to fighting against Germans, they now saw with their own eyes that not all wore the same face of fanaticism. Wehrmacht soldiers, once their sworn enemies, had stood shoulder to shoulder with them against the SS. This paradox altered the way some soldiers thought about the war, introducing complexity into a conflict often painted in black and white. They recognized in Josef Gangl and his men the same determination to fight for humanity, even if born of different circumstances, to fight side by side, to share danger and loss, created bonds that transcended nationality. The GIs later spoke of the surreal camaraderie of that day, an unlikely brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat. For them, the symbolism of Castle Itter lay in the proof that moral courage could come from unexpected places. It reminded them that humanity existed even among those they had been taught to despise. In this way, the battle reinforced the deeper meaning of their mission in Europe. They were not simply crushing an enemy, they were defending a world where conscience could survive. Castle Itter gave that mission human form. The presence of Wehrmacht soldiers in the alliance remains the most striking element of the battle's symbolism. For years, the Wehrmacht had been the backbone of Hitler's expansionist war, enforcing his orders with ruthless efficiency. Yet here, in the final hours of the Reich, elements of that same army broke ranks, choosing defiance over obedience. Their decision to stand with Americans and French prisoners symbolized the moral fractures tearing apart the German war machine. Josef Gangl's death became the ultimate emblem of this transformation, a Wehrmacht officer laying down his life to shield those once condemned as enemies. In him, history saw the possibility of redemption. Rare though it was, his men too carried the weight of that choice, risking execution and dishonor had the battle ended differently. They redefined their legacy in a single act of resistance. Castle Itter revealed that even in a war of absolutes, individual conscience could create exceptions. This symbolism carried weight far beyond Tyrol, echoing into post-war memory. It showed that humanity could survive within the machinery of destruction. It proved that honor could outlive ideology. The symbolism of Castle Itter also lay in its timing. Occurring in May 1945, as Hitler was already dead and Berlin had fallen, it was one of the final military engagements in Europe. By then, most battles were driven by desperation rather than strategy. Yet Castle Itter carried a moral purpose that set it apart. It was not about seizing land or destroying armies, but about saving lives and protecting human dignity. The convergence of forces highlighted how, in the twilight of war, old divisions could blur in the face of shared humanity. The French VIPs represented the future of a liberated Europe. The Americans represented the liberating force of democracy. The Wehrmacht defectors represented redemption and resistance within Germany itself. The SS represented the collapsing tyranny of fanaticism. To see these elements collide in one alpine castle gave the battle a symbolic resonance unmatched by larger engagements. In scale it was small, but in meaning it was immense. It was the war in miniature, oppression challenged, alliances reshaped, and humanity struggling to endure. The timing made it a fitting coda to the European conflict. Its symbolism was amplified by its place at history's very edge. For Austria, the symbolism of Castle Itter resonated deeply in the years after the war. The country, annexed by Hitler in 1938, had been both victim and collaborator in the Nazi experiment. Many Austrians struggled with questions of complicity, identity, and redemption. Castle Itter offered a rare story that they could claim with pride. Here on Austrian soil, Germans had defied the SS and chosen to protect Frenchmen and Americans. Josef Gangl became a symbol of Austrian resistance, proof that even within the Wehrmacht there had been men who stood for humanity. The castle itself became part of this narrative, a silent monument to defiance in the heart of Tyrol. For locals, the story provided a counterweight to the shame of Austria's role in the Reich. It became a symbol of the possibility of moral courage within their nation. This symbolism, passed through oral tradition and commemoration, shaped how the region remembered the war. The fallen hero and the battle itself became part of Austrian identity. Castle Itter thus carried meaning, not only for the victors, but for the land that hosted it. It was a story of redemption written in stone. In the wider historical narrative, Castle Itter's symbolism grew as historians and storytellers uncovered its details. It became known as the Strangest Battle of World War II, a title that only enhanced its mythic quality. Yet beyond strangeness lay profound lessons about the fluidity of alliances and the universality of conscience. Scholars highlighted how the battle exposed cracks in the Nazi edifice, showing that even loyal soldiers could reject tyranny. Others emphasized the extraordinary collaboration between enemies, proof that survival and morality could override hatred. Filmmakers, writers, and educators seized on the story, presenting it as a microcosm of war's contradictions. For audiences, the image of Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen fighting side by side against the SS was both bewildering and inspiring. The symbolism transcended military history, entering cultural imagination as a parable of unity. In an age when wars often divide, Castle Itter became an example of how divisions could dissolve under extraordinary circumstances. Its story resonated because it was not about conquest but about conscience. It carried meaning far beyond its small scale. It became legend because it symbolized hope. Ultimately, the symbolism of the Battle of Castle Itter lies in its defiance of war's rigid categories. It was not a clash of nations, but of values, where humanity itself stood against fanaticism. Wehrmacht soldiers, American GIs, and French leaders discovered common cause, not in ideology, but in survival and honor. Together, they created a story that challenged the simplicity of enemy and ally, friend and foe. In this sense, the castle became a stage where war's complexity was laid bare for history to see. The symbolism rests in the unity of conscience, in the reminder that even in the darkest times, men could choose the light. It is a story that echoes long after the guns fell silent, because it speaks not only of war, but of humanity. Castle Itter is remembered not for its scale but for its meaning. Its walls carried bullets and blood, but also dignity and solidarity. The strange alliance forged there reminds us of the choices that define us. In war as in peace, humanity's greatest strength lies in unity. Castle Itter stands as proof of that enduring truth. In the years following World War II, Castle Itter's strange and dramatic story found its place within the vast tapestry of the conflict's memory. Unlike the massive battles of Stalingrad, Normandy, or the Bulge, this small clash in the Austrian Alps might easily have been forgotten. Yet its surreal nature ensured that it would live on in recollection and retelling. Historians, veterans, and survivors recognized immediately that something unique had occurred at Itter. It was not a battle of thousands, but of dozens, and its symbolism was far greater than its scale. French prisoners remembered it as their miraculous deliverance. American soldiers carried it home as one of the strangest and most inspiring episodes of their war. For Austrians, it became part of local folklore, a story told with pride of a moment when their land witnessed a rare act of conscience. Over time, the memory of Castle Itter was preserved through testimonies, memoirs, and later historical accounts. It remained a curious footnote to some, but to others it was a powerful emblem of humanity amidst destruction. Its memory endured because it was more than war. It was a story of people transcending division that ensured its place in the history of the Second World War. One of the central figures enshrined in this memory was Major Josef Gangl, whose sacrifice became a symbol of Austrian resistance and redemption. Though a Wehrmacht officer, his decision to fight alongside Americans and protect French prisoners set him apart from the blind obedience of his peers. In Austria, he was hailed as a hero in the years that followed. Streets and memorials bore his name, reminding future generations of his courage. Locals in Tyrol remembered him as a man who had already acted to shield civilians from pointless destruction in the final weeks of the war. His death at Castle Itter, protecting a French dignitary from sniper fire, gave his story a tragic but noble conclusion. Gangl became proof that honor could be found even within the ranks of the Reich's army. For Austria, which struggled after the war with questions of guilt and complicity, his legacy offered a narrative of moral courage. He became part of Austria's national memory, a story passed down with reverence. Today his name is invoked as one of the rare Wehrmacht officers remembered for humanity rather than cruelty. In Gangl, Castle Itter found its most enduring symbol. His legacy grew brighter as the years went on. Another figure who emerged in memory was Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr., the American commander who had led the rescue with steady resolve. For the Americans, he embodied the role of liberator, balancing courage with pragmatism in the face of overwhelming odds. His leadership during the defense of Castle Itter earned him respect from allies and gratitude from the French VIPs. Survivors spoke of his calm presence, his tactical skill, and his willingness to risk everything for men who were strangers to him. In later accounts, Lee himself downplayed his role, giving credit to his men and to the unexpected cooperation with Gangl. Yet to those who were there, his actions were decisive. He had rallied Americans, Germans, and French into a fighting unit, transforming chaos into resistance. For the U.S. Army, his story became one of the more unusual but inspiring tales of the European campaign. His name was tied forever to the legend of Castle Itter. In memory, he stood as the counterpart to Gangl, the American liberator to the German defector. Together their legacies formed the twin pillars of the castle's story. They became inseparable in the narrative of the strangest battle of World War II. The French VIP prisoners also carried Castle Itter into memory through their testimonies and writings. Men like Paul Reynaud, Édouard Daladier, and General Maxime Weygand recounted their surreal experience of fighting for survival inside the castle walls. Their voices added weight to the story, for these were not anonymous prisoners but figures of national importance. Their survival had implications for post-war France, but their gratitude toward their rescuers gave the battle a moral dimension. They described in detail the shock of seeing Wehrmacht soldiers turn against the SS and the bravery of the Americans who came to their aid. Some even confessed their own small roles in the defense, carrying ammunition or shouting encouragement under fire. Their memoirs and statements after the war ensured that Castle Itter was not forgotten in France. For the French public, the story was both inspiring and ironic. Leaders once imprisoned by Germany had been saved by a German officer's sacrifice. It became a tale told with pride, one that symbolized France's endurance under occupation. Their accounts helped solidify the castle's place in memory. Itter became part of France's narrative of liberation. Their voices kept it alive in history. The castle itself, perched on its rocky outcrop in the Tyrolean Alps, became a living monument to the story. After the war, it stood scarred but intact, its walls still bearing the marks of bullets and shrapnel. For locals, it was a place where memory was tangible, where history had left visible traces. Tourists and historians came to see the site of the Strangest battle, walking through the same courtyards where French leaders had stood and where Josef Gangl had fallen. Over time, Castle Itter became less a fortress and more a shrine to the bizarre and inspiring clash it had hosted. Its preservation was not merely architectural but symbolic, for its stones carried the weight of memory. Each room whispered stories of captivity, fear, and ultimately liberation. The castle became a focal point for commemorations, with plaques and memorials ensuring the story would not fade. For Austria, it was a reminder that even in the heart of war, moments of defiance could take root. Castle Itter's very presence embodied the endurance of memory. It stood as proof that history leaves marks not only in books but in places. Its preservation kept the battle alive for generations. Historians played a critical role in shaping the memory of Castle Itter for the wider world. In the immediate aftermath of the war, it was recorded in reports and testimonies, but over time, its uniqueness drew greater attention. Writers and scholars marveled at the surreal alliance forged within its walls. They recognized that Castle Itter stood out among the countless battles of World War II because it inverted the usual logic of enmity. For military historians, it became a case study in how desperation, conscience, and circumstance could create extraordinary coalitions. For cultural historians, it represented the moral complexity of war, where lines between enemy and ally blurred. Books, articles, and documentaries retold the story, ensuring it reached audiences far beyond Austria and France. Each retelling emphasized its symbolic meaning as much as its tactical details. Castle Itter became a story that resonated not just as military history, but as moral history. It was remembered because it defied expectation. It endured because it spoke to the human condition. Historians ensured its place as one of the war's most fascinating episodes. They gave structure to its legacy in collective memory. In popular culture, Castle Itter also found its way into novels, films, and television. Its story, almost too strange to believe, appealed to storytellers who sought drama and inspiration from the war. Writers emphasized the surreal alliances, the heroism of individuals, and the claustrophobic tension of the siege. Filmmakers imagined the castle as both fortress and stage, where history's contradictions played out under fire. Each adaptation brought the story to new audiences, turning local memory into global legend. For many, the battle became known not through archives but through these retellings. Its strangeness captured imaginations, its humanity stirred emotions, and its uniqueness ensured it stood out. In classrooms and documentaries, it was often presented as the strangest battle of World War II, a title that sparked curiosity. Yet behind the drama, the story remained grounded in fact, anchored by the testimonies of those who lived it. Popular culture kept it alive, where formal history might have let it fade. It became not only remembered, but mythologized. Castle Itter's legacy expanded with every retelling. Its story traveled far beyond the Alps. Today, Castle Itter remains a symbol of memory, legacy, and the enduring lessons of war. Its story continues to inspire, not because of its scale, but because of its meaning. It is remembered as a place where enemies became allies, where conscience triumphed over ideology, and where humanity prevailed in the face of fanaticism. Josef Gangl and Captain Jack Lee stand as twin heroes of that moment, their names tied forever to its legend. The French VIPs who survived carried its story into history, shaping how it was remembered in Europe. Austria preserved it as part of its own reckoning with the past, ensuring the story was not lost. Historians, writers, and filmmakers carried it further, embedding it into cultural memory. The castle itself still stands, scarred yet proud, a monument to unity in the strangest of battles. Its legacy is one of hope as much as tragedy. Castle Itter endures as proof that even in the darkest days of World War II, light could break through. Its memory belongs not only to Austria, but to the world. It is a reminder of humanity's capacity for courage and redemption. Castle Itter's battle stands as more than a curious footnote in the chronicles of World War II. It is a mirror reflecting the contradictions and complexities of humanity in wartime. Unlike the epic clashes that decided the fate of nations, it was a confrontation fought by a handful of men bound together not by ideology, but by necessity and conscience. The surreal image of Wehrmacht soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with American GIs, defending French dignitaries against SS fanatics, encapsulated the collapsing absurdity of Hitler's Reich. This unity across enemy lines carried a symbolism far greater than the small skirmish itself. It underscored the fact that even in the final days of a war built on hatred and division, humanity could carve out its own path. The story illustrates how courage often emerges in unexpected places from men like Josef Gangl, who broke free from obedience to tyranny. It shows how honor can be redefined when survival is not enough, and moral choices demand more. Castle Itter's defenders demonstrated that even amid rubble and despair, lines could blur in the service of justice. Their actions defied the logic of totalitarianism, replacing it with the logic of humanity. This was not simply a battle, it was a statement that honor survives even when empires crumble. The strange alliances forged at Castle Itter reveal the extraordinary fluidity of human relationships in the face of mortal danger. Soldiers conditioned to see one another as mortal enemies found themselves sharing ammunition, shouting encouragement, and fighting side by side. The Wehrmacht, once Hitler's tool of conquest, here fractured under the weight of conscience, represented by Gangl's defection. The Americans, seasoned liberators, extended trust to men who wore the uniforms of yesterday's adversary. The French dignitaries, accustomed to positions of power, discovered themselves shoulder to shoulder with both allies and former enemies, united in desperation. It was as if the walls of ideology melted under the fire of necessity. In this crucible, survival bred solidarity, and solidarity bred a sense of shared humanity. For a fleeting moment, the divisions that had fueled years of conflict dissolved. This alliance was not born of politics or treaties, but of instinct and morality. It became a microcosm of what reconciliation after the war might look like. At Castle Itter, history gave us a glimpse of cooperation amid destruction. It showed how strange partnerships can achieve the extraordinary. The lessons of courage from Castle Itter extend far beyond the battlefield. Josef Gangl's decision to turn his back on Hitler's Reich was not simply a tactical choice but a moral one, rooted in the protection of civilians and the defense of dignity. His sacrifice immortalized the notion that honor can survive even within compromised institutions. Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr. Ist leadership showed how determination and adaptability could unify men of wildly different backgrounds into a cohesive defense. The French VIPs too found courage in their own way, refusing to succumb to despair and even assisting in their defense when the moment demanded. These were not acts of grand strategy, but of human resolve, born of conscience and necessity. Each figure embodied a different kind of bravery: Gangl's selfless defiance, Lee's steady command, the French prisoner's resilience. Together, their actions created a narrative that transcended military outcomes. It was courage that gave meaning to the battle far beyond its small scale. In their choices, we see the possibility of human nobility even in the darkest hours. Their example teaches us that courage often begins where certainty ends. The battle also offers profound reflections on honor, what it means, how it survives, and how it can be reclaimed. In a war dominated by betrayal, fanaticism, and brutality, Castle Itter represented a return to older codes of chivalry. Soldiers fought not for conquest or ideology, but for the protection of innocence. The decision of German soldiers to fight against their own former comrades in the SS symbolized a final rejection of tyranny. For the Americans, extending trust to their former enemies was an act of magnanimity, one that elevated the defense from mere survival to something transcendent. The French dignitaries, caught between humiliation and survival, discovered honor in perseverance and solidarity. Honor at Castle Itter was not defined by victory, but by the willingness to risk everything for what was right. It became a rare instance where war's cruelty gave way to war's humanity. The defenders' stand echoed older traditions of knights protecting the weak, yet it was forged in the very heart of modern mechanized war. It reminds us that honor is not erased by uniforms or allegiances. Instead, it is defined by choices. Castle Itter proved that honor can be found in the most unlikely alliances. As the war approached its surreal final days, the battle at Castle Itter also highlighted the collapse of ideology itself. The Reich that had once claimed absolute loyalty now fractured under pressure, with soldiers defecting to conscience and commanders losing their grip. The SS, desperate and fanatical, symbolized the last violent spasms of a dying regime. The Wehrmacht defectors and the Americans, standing together, represented the emerging world beyond Hitler's tyranny. The French prisoners symbolized Europe's survival, battered but unbroken, emerging from captivity into freedom. The battle distilled the chaos of the Reich's collapse into one concentrated moment. It demonstrated that when tyranny falls, it does so not only through force of arms, but through the erosion of loyalty from within. The surreal quality of the fight, with sworn enemies united against fanatics, perfectly captured the contradictions of the war's end. It was an echo of history's strange ironies, where the improbable becomes reality. Castle Itter showed that the death throes of regimes can produce unexpected acts of unity. In its final hours, the Reich's collapse gave birth to a moment of humanity. This paradox made the battle unforgettable. In broader reflection, Castle Itter symbolizes the enduring possibility of reconciliation. It showed that war, though defined by enmity, can produce moments of shared humanity that transcend generations. The cooperation of Germans, Americans, and French at the castle foreshadowed the post-war alliances that would rebuild Europe. It hinted at the future partnership between former enemies in NATO, the European Union, and the shared defense of peace. For historians, Castle Itter became a small but powerful case study in how trust can be built even after years of hatred. For moral thinkers, it became an example of how human beings can reject ideology when confronted with the face of suffering. The memory of Castle Itter has inspired reflections not only about war, but about the possibility of peace. Its defenders proved that reconciliation does not begin in conference halls, but in the shared struggle for survival. They showed that unity can emerge from the ashes of division. Castle Itter thus became a lesson in how humanity can endure beyond the guns. It foreshadowed the world that would rise from the ruins of 1945. Its meaning was larger than the battle itself. The surreal firefight in the Tyrolean Alps also forces us to reflect on the nature of memory itself. Why do we remember some battles and not others? Castle Itter is remembered not because of numbers or territory, but because of meaning. It illustrates that memory is shaped by symbolism as much as by statistics. For survivors, the story became a testament to survival, courage, and moral clarity in chaos. For later generations, it became a parable of humanity amidst destruction. Historians and filmmakers alike have returned to it because it tells us something essential about the human condition. It reassures us that even in the darkest chapters of history, sparks of light can emerge. It challenges us to look beyond the brutality of war to the choices individuals make within it. Memory of Castle Itter has been preserved not only through archives, but through conscience. It survives because it is not just military history, it is moral history. Its lessons endure because they speak to values larger than war itself. Castle Itter remains alive in memory because it embodies hope. Ultimately, the lessons of Castle Itter remind us that history is not only about power, territory, and victory. It is also about moments where humanity asserts itself against the weight of destruction. The defenders of the castle, Americans, Germans, and French, proved that honor, conscience, and courage can flourish even when surrounded by fanaticism and ruin. Their alliance was fleeting, but its symbolism was eternal. It showed that enemies could become brothers when confronted with tyranny. It reminded us that moral choices matter, even in the chaos of war. The story endures because it speaks to the best within us, not merely the worst. Castle Itter may have been the strangest battle of World War II, but it was also one of its most meaningful. It distilled the paradox of the war's end into a single fight. It stands today as a monument to reconciliation, courage, and humanity. Its lessons are not locked in 1945. They echo into every age where conscience must triumph over cruelty. Castle Itter's defenders left us a story that transcends war. They left us a legacy of humanity amidst destruction.